in the silence between mountain and sea, where ancient rivers once whispered secrets to the desert wind. There lies a story older than pyramids, more mysterious than forgotten gods. Here, in the shadow of the Andes, where the sun first kissed the earth each morning, a civilization rose from dust and dreams, built monuments to eternity, and vanished into the embrace of time itself. No gold adorned their temples, no written words proclaimed their deeds, yet their voices still echo in the stones they left behind. This is the tale of Norte Chico, the mother of cities, the grandmother of civilizations, where humanity first learned to dream in stone and organize in harmony with the rhythms of earth and sky. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts just like yours. The story of Norte Chico begins not with kings or conquest, but with the gentle persistence of water finding its way through an impossible landscape. For rivers, the war of Supe, Vilca, and Fortaleza carved their paths from the towering peaks of the Andes down through valleys that seemed painted in shades of gold and amber, finally reaching the cool embrace of the Pacific Ocean. These ribbons of life created oases in what would otherwise have been an endless expanse of coastal desert. And it was here, in these precious green corridors, that humanity would first experiment with the delicate art of civilization. The geography of this region was nothing short of miraculous. To the east, the Andes Mountains rose like sleeping giants, their peaks crowned with snow that would melt each spring to feed the rivers below. To the west, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon, its cold currents carrying nutrients that would make the coastal waters among the richest fishing grounds in the world. Between these two great forces of nature lay a narrow strip of land, perhaps 30 miles wide, where the meeting of mountain runoff and ocean moisture created a unique ecosystem that would prove perfect for the birth of complex society. The climate was gentle and predictable, with warm, dry summers and mild winters that rarely brought rain. The rivers provided a steady source of fresh water, while the ocean offered an abundance of fish, shellfish, and marine mammals. The soil, enriched by centuries of river deposits, proved fertile enough to support agriculture, though it would require careful management and innovation to make it truly productive. This was not a land of obvious plenty like the Nile, Delta, or the valleys of Mesopotamia. Instead, it was a place that demanded cooperation, planning, and careful stewardship of resources. The people who would eventually call this region home would need to learn to work together, to share water and land, to coordinate their efforts in ways that had never been attempted before in human history. They would need to become the first true civilization builders, the architects of a new way of human existence. The natural harbors along the coast provided safe anchorage for fishing vessels, while the river valleys offered protected spaces for settlement and agriculture. The combination of marine and terrestrial resources created a unique opportunity for population growth and social complexity. Here, for the first time in the Americas, conditions were perfect for the development of large permanent settlements, complex social hierarchies, and monumental architecture. The winds that blew across this landscape carried more than just moisture and warmth. They carried the seeds of change, the whispers of possibility, the promise of a future where human beings could create something greater than the sum of their individual efforts. The land itself seemed to call out for organization, for planning, for the kind of large-scale cooperation that would eventually give birth to cities and states. As the centuries passed, small groups of hunters and gatherers began to notice the patterns in this landscape. They learned when the rivers would flood, when the fish would be most abundant, when the wild plants would fruit. They began to spend longer periods in the most favorable locations, returning season after season to the same campsites, the same fishing spots, the same gathering grounds. Slowly, imperceptibly, they began to put down roots. The process was so gradual that no single generation would have noticed a change. Parents taught their children the old ways of following the herds and the seasons, but increasingly, those children found reasons to stay close to home. The rivers provided reliable water, the ocean provided reliable food, and the mild climate made permanent settlement not just possible but increasingly attractive. Over time, these seasonal camps became permanent villages. The villages grew into towns, and the towns began to compete and cooperate with one another in ways that would eventually lead to the development of the first true cities in the Americas. The land between the waters was becoming something new, something that had never existed before in human history. The earliest inhabitants of the Norte Chico region were descendants of the Great Migration that had brought human beings to the Americas thousands of years before. These were people who would cross the Bering Land Bridge during the last ice age, following mammoths and other large game animals across a landscape that no longer exists. Their ancestors had been nomadic hunters and gatherers, living in small bands that moved constantly in search of food and shelter. By the time these early peoples reached the coastal valleys of what would become Peru, they had been walking for generations. They had learned to adapt to every conceivable environment, from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest, from high mountain passes to coastal plains. They were skilled hunters, talented craftspeople, and experienced survivors who had proven their ability to thrive in even the most challenging conditions. The archaeological evidence suggests that humans first arrived in the Norte Chico region around 10,000 years ago, during a period when the climate was somewhat different from what it would later become. The rivers were larger then, the rainfall more abundant, and the coastal ecosystem even richer than it would be in later millennia. These early inhabitants found a land of remarkable plenty, where the skills they had developed over thousands of years of migration would finally allow them to stop wandering and begin building something permanent. The first settlements were simple affairs, small camps near the rivers where extended families could gather during the richest fishing seasons. These early Norte Chico people lived in temporary shelters made from wood and reeds, following a seasonal round that took them from the coast to the river valleys to the foothills of the Andes and back again. They were still essentially nomadic, but their movements were becoming more predictable, more tied to the specific resources of this particular region. The transition from nomadic to sedentary life was not sudden. It took place over many centuries, as generation after generation of families found reasons to stay a little longer in the most favorable locations. The children grew up knowing the rivers intimately, understanding the seasonal patterns of fish, runs, and plant growth in ways that their parents, who had grown up elsewhere, could never match. These children became the first true natives of Norte Chico, the first people to call this land home. Archaeological sites from this early period show evidence of increasingly sophisticated toolmaking, food processing, and shelter construction. The people were learning to make the most of the resources available to them, developing new techniques for fishing, hunting, and gathering that were specifically adapted to their environment. They were becoming not just residents of the region, but partners with the land itself. The most significant development during this early period was the gradual shift from a purely hunting and gathering economy to one that included elements of cultivation, and management. The people began to notice that certain plants grew better in areas where they had camped, where the soil had been enriched by human waste and food scraps. They began to deliberately plant seeds in these locations, returning season after season to harvest the crops they had sown. This was not yet true agriculture as we understand it today, but it was the beginning of a relationship between humans and plants that would eventually revolutionize human society. The people were learning to work with nature rather than simply taking from it, to invest effort in the present for rewards that would come in the future. They were developing the patient, long-term thinking that would eventually make possible the construction of cities and the organization of complex societies at the same time. The people were developing increasingly sophisticated social structures. The small bands of earlier times were growing into larger groups with more complex systems of leadership and cooperation. Extended families were joining together to form tribes, and tribes were beginning to interact with one another in ways that would eventually lead to the development of trade networks and political alliances. The evidence from this period suggests that these early Norte Chico people were remarkably peaceful. There are few signs of warfare or conflict in the archaeological record, and the settlements show no evidence of defensive fortifications or weapons designed specifically for fighting other humans. Instead, the people seem to have devoted their energies to cooperation, to finding ways to work together rather than compete against one another. This peaceful character would become one of the defining features of Norte Chico's civilization throughout its long history. Unlike many other early civilizations, which were built on conquest and military expansion, Norte Chico seems to have grown. Through cooperation and mutual benefit, the people learned to share resources, to coordinate their efforts, to build something greater than any individual community could achieve alone. As the centuries passed, and the communities of Norte Chico grew more stable and prosperous, the people began to develop new ways of understanding and organizing their world. They noticed patterns in the natural cycles around them, the flooding of the rivers, the migration of fish, the growth and decay of plants, and they began to see these patterns as expressions of deeper principles that governed all of life. The development of agriculture was central to this new understanding. The people had learned to cultivate cotton, beans, squash, and other crops that grew well in the river valleys. They had discovered that certain plants grew better when planted. Together, that crop rotation could maintain soil fertility, and that careful management of water resources could dramatically increase yields. Agriculture required planning, cooperation, and a deep understanding of natural cycles that went far beyond anything needed for hunting and gathering. The cultivation of cotton was particularly significant. Cotton was not a food crop, but it provided the raw material for textiles that would become increasingly important in Norte Chico society. The people learned to spin cotton fibers into thread, to weave thread into cloth, and to dye cloth in patterns that held religious and social significance. Textile production became a specialized craft that required considerable skill and time, and the finished products became valuable trade goods that could be exchanged for other resources. The development of textile production had profound implications. For Norte Chico society, it meant that some people could specialize in activities other than food production, leading to the development of craft specialization and social stratification. It also meant that the communities could produce goods that were valuable for trade, allowing them to acquire resources that were not available locally. Most importantly, it demonstrated that human beings could create beauty and meaning through their labor, that work could be more than just survival. The people also developed sophisticated, systems of irrigation that allowed them to extend agriculture into areas that would otherwise have been too dry for cultivation. They built canals and channels that directed river water to fields located at considerable distances from the natural watercourses. They developed methods for storing water during the wet season and distributing it during the dry season. They learned to manage their water resources as a community asset that required collective decision-making and collective maintenance. These irrigation systems were marvels of engineering that required mathematical precision and careful planning. The people had to calculate gradients, design channels that would carry water without eroding, and coordinate the distribution of water among multiple users. They had to develop systems of measurement and standardization that would allow them to replicate successful designs. They had to create institutions that could make decisions about water allocation and resolve disputes about water rights. The construction and maintenance of irrigation systems also required unprecedented levels of cooperation. Entire communities had to work together to dig channels, build dams, and maintain the infrastructure that made agriculture possible. Individual families could not create these systems on their own. They required the coordinated effort of dozens, or even hundreds of people working toward common goals. This need for cooperation led to the development of more complex social and political structures. The communities needed leaders who could coordinate large-scale projects, specialists who could design and maintain technical systems, and institutions that could make collective decisions and resolve conflicts. They needed ways of organizing labor, distributing resources, and maintaining social cohesion on a scale that had never been attempted before in human history. The people also began to develop new forms of artistic and religious expression that reflected their growing understanding of the world around them. They created textiles with increasingly complex patterns, ceramics with sophisticated designs, and jewelry that incorporated materials from distant regions. They built ceremonial structures that demonstrated their ability to organize large-scale construction projects and their desire to create permanent expressions of their beliefs and values. The religious beliefs of the Norte Chico people seemed to have focused on the forces of nature that were most important to their survival and prosperity. They developed elaborate rituals associated with planting and harvesting, with the flooding of rivers and the movements of celestial bodies. They created representations of plants and animals that were important to their economy, and they developed complex symbolism that expressed their understanding of the relationships between human beings and the natural world. These religious practices were not separate from the practical activities of daily life. Instead, they were integrated into agriculture, craft production, and community organization in ways that reinforced social cooperation and collective decision-making. Religious ceremonies became opportunities for communities to come together, to reaffirm their shared values, and to coordinate their activities for the coming season. The development of these more complex social, economic, and religious systems marked a turning point in the history of Norteco. The people were no longer simply adapting to their environment. They were actively reshaping it to meet their needs. They were creating new forms of human organization that would serve as models for civilizations throughout the Americas and around the world. Around 3500 BCE, something remarkable began to happen in the valleys of Norte Chico. The people, who had spent centuries learning to work together in small communities, began to dream on a scale that had never been attempted before. They began to build structures that were not just functional but monumental, not just practical but symbolic, not just temporary but designed to last for eternity. The first monumental buildings of Norte Chico were pyramid-like structures that rose from the flat floors of the river valleys like artificial mountains. These were not the steep, pointed pyramids that would later be built in Egypt or Mesoamerica, but rather broad, terraced platforms that seemed to emerge organically from the landscape itself. They were built from locally quarried stone and millions of carefully woven bags filled with smaller stones, creating structures that were both massive and flexible, capable of withstanding the earthquakes that periodically shook the region. The construction of these monuments required organizational capabilities that went far beyond anything the people had previously attempted. Each structure required the coordinated effort of hundreds or even thousands of workers over periods that may have lasted for decades. The builders had to quarry stone from distant locations, transport it to the construction sites, and fit it together with precision that would have challenged even modern engineers. The technology used in these constructions was ingenious in its simplicity. The builders did not have metal tools, wheeled vehicles, or large domesticated animals to help with the work. Instead, they relied on human labor, simple tools made from stone and wood, and sophisticated knowledge of engineering principles. They developed techniques for moving massive stones using ropes, ramps, and levers. They learned to create stable foundations on soft ground, to build walls that would resist both gravity and seismic activity, and to design structures that would maintain their integrity over centuries. The most impressive of these early monuments is the complex at Caral, which includes multiple pyramid structures, circular plazas, and residential areas that together cover more than 150 acres. The largest pyramid at Caral rises to a height of nearly 100 feet and contains an estimated 100,000 tons of stone. The construction of this single structure would have required the full-time labor of several hundred people for many years, representing an investment of human effort that could only have been sustained by a highly organized and prosperous society. The design of these monuments reveals sophisticated understanding of both engineering and aesthetics. The builders created structures that were not only functional but beautiful, with carefully proportioned spaces, elegant stonework, and complex symbolic decorations. They integrated their buildings with the natural landscape, positioning them to take advantage of views of the surrounding mountains and valleys, and orienting them to align with the movements of the sun and stars. The purpose of these monuments was clearly more than practical. While they may have served as platforms for religious ceremonies, as residences for elite families, or as centers for community gatherings, they were also powerful symbols of the community's ability to work together toward common goals. They demonstrated that the people of Norte Chico could marshal resources, coordinate complex projects, and create permanent expressions of their shared identity and values. The construction of monumental architecture also created new forms of social organization and specialization. The projects required skilled architects and engineers who could design the structures, master craftspeople who could execute the most complex elements of the construction, and project managers who could coordinate the work of large groups of laborers. They required systems for organizing and supplying workers, for managing resources, and for maintaining quality control over long periods of time. These new forms of specialization led to the development of more complex social hierarchies. The communities were no longer composed simply of families and extended kinship groups, but included distinct social classes based on occupation, skill, and responsibility. There were leaders who made decisions about community projects, specialists who possessed technical knowledge, and workers who provided the labor that made construction possible. The evidence suggests that these hierarchies were not based on coercion or exploitation, but rather on mutual benefit and voluntary cooperation. The leaders were those who could best organize collective efforts. The specialists were those who possessed the most valuable skills, and the workers were those who contributed their labor in exchange for participation in the community's prosperity. The monuments themselves were communal achievements that benefited everyone, not private palaces built for the exclusive use of elites. The construction of monumental architecture also required the development of new technologies and techniques. The builders had to learn to quarry stone efficiently, to transport heavy materials over long distances, and to lift massive blocks to considerable heights. They had to develop new tools, new methods of measurement and calculation, and new ways of organizing and coordinating complex projects. Perhaps most importantly, the construction of these monuments required the development of new forms of social, memory, and cultural transmission. The projects took so long to complete that they spanned multiple generations, requiring that knowledge and skills be passed down from parents to children, from masters to apprentices. The communities had to develop traditions and institutions that could maintain continuity over time, that could preserve both the technical knowledge and the social commitment necessary to complete these ambitious undertakings. The success of these projects demonstrated that the people of Norte Chico had developed capabilities that would serve them well in the challenges that lay ahead. They had learned to work together on a scale that had never been attempted before in human history. They had developed technologies and social institutions that would allow them to create increasingly complex and sophisticated forms of civilization. They had proven that human beings could achieve remarkable things when they combined their individual efforts toward common goals. As the great monuments of Norte Chico rose from the valley floors, they changed not only the physical landscape, but also the mental landscape of the people who built them. The communities that had once thought in terms of seasons and generations now began to think in terms of centuries and millennia. They began to see themselves as part of a larger story, as contributors to a legacy that would outlast their individual lives and link them to both their ancestors and their descendants. The monuments became focal points for community, identity, and pride. They were places where people could gather for ceremonies and celebrations, where they could meet with members of other communities for trade and diplomacy, where they could demonstrate their achievements to visitors from distant regions. They were symbols of what human beings could accomplish when they worked together, and they inspired the people to attempt even greater achievements in the future. The construction of monumental architecture also had profound implications for the relationship between the Norte Chico communities and their environment. The projects required the extraction of enormous quantities of stone, the clearing of large areas of land, and the diversion of water resources for construction purposes. The people had to learn to manage these activities in ways that would not damage the ecological systems that supported their agriculture and their overall prosperity. The evidence suggests that they were remarkably successful in achieving this balance. The monuments were built using locally available materials that could be quarried without serious environmental damage. The construction activities seem to have been carefully planned to minimize disruption to agricultural activities. The communities appear to have maintained their commitment to environmental stewardship even as they undertook these massive construction projects. This achievement represents one of the most remarkable aspects of Norte Chico civilization. At a time when many other societies were beginning to exhaust their natural resources through overexploitation, the people of Norte Chico were learning to pursue monumental goals while maintaining the ecological balance that made their prosperity possible, they were developing forms of civilization that were both ambitious and sustainable, both impressive and harmonious with their environment. As the 4th millennium BCE drew to a close, the people of Norte Chico had accomplished something unprecedented in human history. They had created the first true cities in the Americas, developed the first monumental architecture in the Western Hemisphere, and established the first complex civilizations in the New World. They had proven that human beings could organize themselves into large, stable communities that could pursue collective goals while maintaining individual freedom and dignity. They had demonstrated that civilization could be built on cooperation rather than conquest, on harmony rather than conflict. The monuments they built would stand for thousands of years, long after the civilization that created them had faded into memory. They would serve as silent witnesses to the achievements of a people who had learned to dream in stone and to build their dreams into reality. They would inspire later generations to attempt their own great works, to push the boundaries of what human beings could accomplish when they worked together toward common goals. But the story of Norte Chico was far from over. The communities that had learned to build monuments would soon learn to build something even more remarkable, a complex network of cities and towns that would span the entire coastal region of Peru. They would develop new technologies, new forms of art and religion, and new ways of organizing human society that would influence civilizations throughout the Americas and around the world. The great age of Norte Chico was just beginning, and the people who had built the first monuments were about to embark on achievements that would dwarf even these remarkable early accomplishments. The stage was set for the flowering of one of the most remarkable civilizations in human history, a civilization that would demonstrate the extraordinary potential of human cooperation and creativity when applied to the challenges of building a better world. The sun set each evening behind the monuments of Norte Chico, casting long shadows across the valley floors and painting the stone structures in shades of gold and amber. The people who had built these monuments looked up at them with pride and satisfaction, knowing that they had created something that would outlast their individual lives and serve as a legacy for future generations. They had learned to work with the rhythms of the natural world, to harness the power of human cooperation, and to create beauty and meaning through their collective efforts. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, the people of Norte Chico began to plan their next great projects. They had proven that they could build monuments that would last for centuries, and now they were ready to build something even more ambitious, a civilization that would serve as a model for human societies throughout the world. The dreams that had inspired the construction of the first monuments were growing into visions of a future that would transform not only their own communities, but the entire course of human history. The morning sun cast long shadows across the emerging monuments of Norte Chico as the 3rd millennium before Christ witnessed humanity's boldest architectural experiments. In the gentle valleys where rivers whispered ancient secrets, a civilization began to speak in stone and earth, creating monuments that would outlast empires yet to be born. The builders of Norte Chico understood something profound about the relationship between earth and sky, between the sacred and the mundane. Their hands shaped a landscape not merely to shelter bodies, but to house the aspirations of entire communities. Each pyramid, each platform, each carefully planned plaza represented a collective dream made manifest in adobe and stone at Caral, the mother city of this ancient world. The Great Pyramid began its slow ascent toward the heavens. Layer upon layer of carefully placed stones and earth rose from the desert floor, each level a testament to the organizational genius of a people who had learned to think beyond the immediate needs of survival. The structure grew not in haste, but with the patient rhythm of generations, each adding their voice to a conversation with eternity. The architecture of Norte Chico spoke a language that transcended mere function. These were not simple buildings, but cosmological statements, attempts to create harmony between the human world and the larger patterns of existence. The pyramids, aligned with celestial movements, their orientations carefully calculated to capture the seasonal rhythms that governed agricultural life. Every angle, every plaza, every carefully placed stone participated in a grand design that modern minds can only begin to comprehend. In the sacred precincts of Aspro, where the desert met the sea, builders constructed platforms that seemed to float between earth and sky. The sound of waves provided a constant bass note to the rhythm of construction. As workers carried baskets of earth and stone up ramps that zigzagged across the growing structures, the salt air carried the scent of ocean kelp and the dust of ancient endeavor, creating an atmosphere thick with human purpose and natural mystery. The amphitheaters of Norte Chico represent, perhaps, the most sophisticated understanding of acoustic engineering in the ancient world. These circular depressions, carved into the earth with mathematical precision, could carry a whisper from the center to the furthest edges of the crowd. In the pre-dawn darkness, when the desert air was still and cold, the human voice could reach across these spaces with crystalline clarity, binding communities together through shared sound and shared purpose. The construction techniques employed by Norte Chico builders revealed a sophisticated understanding of materials and their properties. They discovered that certain combinations of earth and organic matter created adobe that could withstand centuries of earthquake and weather. Red bags filled with stones formed the internal structure of their pyramids, creating a flexible framework that could absorb the shock of seismic activity without collapse. This innovation, born from intimate knowledge of their environment, would influence construction techniques throughout the Andes for millennia to come. The workforce that built these monuments was not composed of slaves driven by whips, but of communities bound together by shared vision and seasonal rhythms. During the flood seasons, when agricultural work was impossible, entire populations would turn to construction, carrying the same cooperative spirit that characterized their farming efforts into the realm of monumental building. The work songs that accompanied the movement of massive stones echoed across the valleys, creating a soundtrack for civilization's emergence at Bonduia. Near the Pacific coast, builders created structures that seemed to grow organically from the landscape itself. The platforms and plazas followed the natural contours of the land, enhancing rather than dominating the environment. Here, the boundary between natural and artificial became beautifully blurred, as human creativity worked in harmony with the existing topography to create spaces that felt both planned and inevitable. The sacred fires that burned atop these monuments sent smoke signals into the thin air of the highlands, creating a communication network that bound the scattered settlements of Norte Chico into a coherent whole. These fires, tended by specialized keepers who understood the language of flame and ember, carried messages across vast distances, coordinating festivals, harvests, and collective undertakings. The glow of these fires, visible from dozens of miles away, served as beacons of civilization in a landscape still largely dominated by wilderness. The monumental architecture of Norte Chico was not merely aesthetic expression, but the physical manifestation of an increasingly complex social organization. As the pyramids rose, so too did the sophistication of the society that built them. The very act of construction required levels of coordination, planning, and hierarchy that transformed loose confederations of farmers into something approaching a state. The residential areas that surrounded the great monuments revealed a society in transition. The earliest houses were simple structures of reeds and mud, but as the civilization matured, dwellings became more elaborate and differentiated. Some residences featured multiple rooms, storage facilities, and courtyards that spoke of increasing wealth and social stratification. The evolution of domestic architecture mirrored the evolution of social complexity, with each generation building upon the achievements of their predecessors. The workshop areas discovered throughout Norte Chico sites provide evidence of specialization that would have been impossible in a simple farming society. Skilled craftsmen dedicated their lives to perfecting particular techniques, creating tools, textiles, and ornaments that displayed increasingly sophisticated artistic sensibilities. The concentration of specialized activities in particular areas of the settlements suggests a level of urban planning that anticipates the great cities of later Andean civilizations. The storage facilities at major Norte Chico sites reveal a society that had learned to think beyond the immediate harvest. Massive granaries, built with careful attention to ventilation and pest control, allowed communities to accumulate surplus food that could support non-agricultural activities. These structures, often located in the most secure areas of the settlements, represented a form of social security that enabled the population to invest time and energy in monumental construction and artistic creation. The distribution of luxury goods throughout Norte Chico's sites suggests trading networks that extended far beyond the immediate river valleys. Shells from the Pacific coast appeared in highland settlements, while highland minerals found their way to coastal sites. This exchange system required sophisticated organization and created relationships of interdependence that bound the various communities of Norte Chico into an economic unit that transcended geographical boundaries. The absence of obvious military fortifications in Norte Chico settlements has led some scholars to characterize this as a peaceful civilization, but the reality was likely more complex. The organization required for monumental construction could easily be adapted for military purposes, and the same hierarchical structures that coordinated building projects could coordinate defense. The peace that characterized Norte Chico may have been enforced by the very social structures that enabled their architectural achievements. The ceremonial spaces at the heart of Norte Chico settlements reveal a society that understood the power of ritual to create and maintain social cohesion. The great plazas, capable of accommodating thousands of people, served as theaters for ceremonies that reinforced social bonds and legitimized political authority. The careful acoustics of these spaces ensured that everyone present could participate in the collective experience, creating moments of unity that transcended individual differences. The administrative buildings that flanked the ceremonial centers suggest a bureaucratic apparatus sophisticated enough to manage the complex logistics of a monument-building society. These structures, often featuring multiple rooms and storage facilities, housed the record keepers and administrators who coordinated the activities of specialized craftsmen, agricultural workers, and construction crews. The development of administrative capacity was as crucial to Norte Chico's achievements as their engineering innovations. The evidence for social stratification in Norte Chico is subtle but unmistakable. Differential access to luxury goods, varying sizes of residential structures, and the existence of specialized burial practices all point to a society that had developed mechanisms for distinguishing between social ranks. However, the degree of inequality appears to have been relatively modest compared to later Andean civilizations, suggesting that Norte Chico may have achieved a balance between social complexity and relative equality. The religious architecture of Norte Chico reflects a spiritual system that emphasized community participation over individual worship. The circular sunken courts that characterize many sites were designed to accommodate group ceremonies rather than private devotion. The integration of religious and administrative functions in the same architectural complexes suggests a society where spiritual and temporal authority were closely intertwined, creating a unified system of social control that was both practical and sacred as the great monuments rose toward the sky. The daily rhythms of Norte Chico life continued with the steady pulse of an agricultural civilization. The contrast between the monumental and the mundane created a unique texture to existence, where ordinary people participated in extraordinary collective achievements while maintaining the intimate routines that sustained individual life. The agricultural calendar dominated the rhythm of Norte Chico life, with the seasonal flooding of the rivers providing the fundamental tempo around which all other activities were organized. During the flood season, when the fields were underwater and agricultural work was impossible, the entire population could turn their attention to construction and craft production. This seasonal pattern created a natural cycle of intensive communal labor that made the monumental achievements of Norte Chico possible. The diet of Norte Chico inhabitants reflected their sophisticated understanding of both agriculture and marine resources. The cultivation of cotton, squash, beans, and various root crops provided the foundation of their nutrition, while the nearby Pacific Ocean offered an abundance of fish, shellfish, and seaweed. The combination of agricultural and marine protein sources created a dietary foundation that could support a large population without depleting local resources. The textile production that characterized Norte Chico society reveals a culture that valued both function and beauty in equal measure. The cotton grown in their fields was transformed into fabrics of remarkable quality, with complex patterns and sophisticated dyeing techniques that created textiles worthy of the most important ceremonial occasions. The time and skill required for textile production suggests a society wealthy enough to support specialists who could dedicate their lives to perfecting these intricate crafts. The fishing technology employed by Norte Chico communities demonstrates their intimate knowledge of marine environments. The nets, hooks, and boats they developed were perfectly adapted to the particular conditions of the Peruvian coast, allowing them to harvest the rich marine resources that supplemented their agricultural production. The dried fish and shellfish that could be stored for long periods provided a crucial source of protein during the lean seasons when agricultural production was insufficient. The social organization of labor in Norte Chico communities appears to have been based on principles of reciprocity and mutual obligation rather than simple hierarchical command. The mita system, which would later characterize Inca society, may have had its origins in the labor practices of Norte Chico, where communities provided labor for collective projects in exchange for access to the products of those projects. This system created social bonds that transcended individual self-interest and made large-scale cooperation possible. The domestic architecture of Norte Chico reveals patterns of family organization that balanced individual privacy with communal participation. The typical residence featured a central courtyard surrounded by smaller rooms that could accommodate extended families while providing spaces for specific activities. The integration of storage facilities into domestic architecture suggests households that were economically independent while remaining socially connected to the larger community. The tool technology developed by Norte Chico craftsmen demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of materials and their properties. The stone tools they created were not merely functional but displayed aesthetic qualities that suggest the tool-making process was valued as much for its artistic expression as for its practical utility. The careful shaping and finishing of everyday implements reveals a culture that saw beauty and function as inseparable aspects of human creation. The food preparation techniques employed in Norte Chico households created flavors and textures that would have been recognizable to modern Peruvian palates. The use of stone grinding implements to process grains and roots, the techniques for preparing and preserving fish, and the methods for cooking in earth ovens all demonstrate a culinary tradition that was both sophisticated and deeply connected to local environmental conditions. The recreational activities that occupied Norte Chico inhabitants during their leisure time reveal a culture that valued both individual skill and collective entertainment. The game boards discovered at various sites suggest strategic games that may have served both as entertainment and as training for the kind of planning and thinking required for large-scale construction projects. The musical instruments found in residential areas indicate a rich tradition of domestic music making that complemented the ceremonial music of the great plazas. The child-rearing practices of Norte Chico society, as evidenced by the toys and miniature tools found in residential areas, suggest a culture that took the education of the young seriously. Children were introduced to adult activities through scaled-down versions of real tools and through participation in family work. This gradual integration of young people into adult society created a seamless transmission of knowledge and skills that maintained cultural continuity across generations. The spiritual life of Norte Chico civilization permeated every aspect of their existence, creating a worldview where the sacred and secular were not separate realms but different aspects of a unified reality. The religious practices that developed in the river valleys of ancient Peru would establish patterns of belief and ritual that would influence Andean cultures for thousands of years to come. The astronomical observations that guided Norte Chico religious practices reveal a sophisticated understanding of celestial cycles and their relationship to earthly events. The alignment of their monuments with specific stars and planetary movements suggests a priestly class that had developed detailed knowledge of astronomical phenomena. These observations were not merely academic exercises, but practical tools for predicting the agricultural cycles that determined the survival of their communities. The ritual use of coca leaves, evidenced by the lime containers found throughout Norte Chico sites, indicates a religious practice that sought to alter consciousness and create direct contact with spiritual forces. The careful preparation and consumption of coca created states of heightened awareness that were believed to facilitate communication with the ancestors and the gods. This practice, which would become central to Andean religious life, had its origins in the spiritual explorations of Norte Chico shamans. The animal symbolism that appears in Norte Chico art and architecture reflects a spiritual system that saw the natural world as alive with sacred power. The recurring motifs of fish, birds, and other animals were not merely decorative but represented spiritual forces that could be invoked through proper ritual practice. The understanding of animals as spiritual allies and teachers created a religious framework that emphasized harmony between human and natural worlds. The The water ceremonies that took place in the sunken courts of Norte Chico settlements demonstrate the central role of water in their spiritual practices. The careful channeling of water through ceremonial spaces created opportunities for ritual purification and for symbolic participation in the life-giving cycles of nature. These water ceremonies, performed during critical agricultural periods, were believed to ensure the continued fertility of the land and the prosperity of the community. The ancestor veneration practices of Norte Chico culture, as evidenced by the careful treatment of human remains and the construction of mortuary facilities, reveal a society that maintained active relationships with the dead. The ancestors were not merely remembered, but were believed to continue participating in the life of the community, providing guidance and protection to their descendants. This ongoing relationship with the dead created a sense of continuity that transcended individual lifespans. The shamanic practices that developed in Norte Chico communities created a class of religious specialists who served as intermediaries between the human and spiritual worlds. These shamans, trained in the use of medicinal plants and ritual techniques, provided healing services and spiritual guidance to their communities. The development of shamanic traditions in Norte Chico would later influence the religious practices of all subsequent Andean civilizations. The seasonal festivals that marked the agricultural calendar became occasions for community-wide celebration and spiritual renewal. These festivals, timed to coincide with planting and harvest seasons, created opportunities for the entire population to participate in collective rituals that reinforced social bonds and renewed spiritual commitments. The elaborate preparations for these festivals involved the entire community and created shared experiences that strengthened cultural identity. The sacred geography of Norte Chico settlements reveals a landscape that was understood to be alive with spiritual power. Certain hills, springs, and river confluences were regarded as especially sacred and became focal points for ritual activity. The integration of these natural sacred sites into the planned architecture of the settlements created a unified sacred landscape that encompassed both natural and human-made elements. The ritual objects found in Norte Chico sites demonstrate a material culture that was thoroughly integrated with spiritual practice. The carefully crafted containers, textiles, and ornaments that accompanied religious ceremonies were not merely functional, but were believed to possess spiritual power in their own right. The creation of these objects required specialized knowledge and skills that were passed down through generations of religious practitioners. The astronomical calendar that governed Norte Chico religious practice created a framework for understanding time that was both practical and spiritual. The careful observation of celestial cycles allowed communities to predict seasonal changes and plan agricultural activities, while also providing a framework for understanding the relationship between earthly events and cosmic forces. This integration of practical and spiritual knowledge created a worldview that was both scientifically sophisticated and deeply religious. The trade networks that connected Norte Chico communities to distant regions reveal a civilization that thought beyond the boundaries of individual river valleys. The exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies created relationships that bound together diverse communities across vast distances, establishing patterns of interaction that would characterize Andean civilization for millennia to come. The cotton textiles produced in Norte Chico workshops became valuable trade goods that were exchanged for exotic materials from distant regions. The quality of Norte Chico cotton and the skill of their weavers created products that were highly sought after by communities throughout the Andes. The trade in textiles not only brought material wealth to Norte Chico communities, but also spread their aesthetic influences and technical innovations to distant regions. The marine resources harvested from the Pacific coast provided Norte Chico communities with trade goods that were especially valuable to highland populations. The dried fish, shellfish, and seaweed that could be transported long distances without spoilage created a reliable source of protein for communities that lacked access to marine resources. The trade in these products created economic relationships that encouraged peaceful contact between diverse communities. The transportation networks that made Norte Chico trade possible required sophisticated organization and infrastructure. The llama caravans that carried goods between coastal and highland regions followed well-established routes that had been developed over generations. The maintenance of these trade routes required cooperation between numerous communities and created a framework for diplomatic relationships that transcended local interests. The luxury goods that entered Norte Chico communities through trade networks reveal a society that had developed sophisticated tastes and the economic capacity to acquire exotic materials. The shells from distant oceans, the colorful feathers from tropical birds, and the precious stones from highland regions all found their way into Norte Chico settlements, where they were incorporated into ceremonial objects and elite burials. The exchange of technological innovations through trade networks accelerated the development of Norte Chico civilization. The agricultural techniques developed in one river valley could be quickly adopted by communities in other regions, while innovations in construction technology and craft production spread rapidly through the network of trading relationships. This exchange of knowledge created a civilization that was greater than the sum of its individual parts. The diplomatic protocols that governed Norte Chico trade relationships reveal a sophisticated understanding of international relations. The exchange of gifts between elite families, the establishment of trading partnerships that could span generations, and the development of mechanisms for resolving disputes all point to a diplomatic system that was both practical and ceremonial. These relationships created a framework for peaceful interaction that may have been as important as military power in maintaining regional stability. The seasonal timing of trade expeditions reveals a sophisticated understanding of environmental conditions and their impact on transportation. The timing of llama caravans to coincide with favorable weather conditions and the coordination of trading activities with agricultural cycles created an efficient system that minimized risk and maximized profit. This careful planning required detailed knowledge of regional conditions and sophistication organizational capabilities. The standardization of weights and measures that characterized Norte Chico trade indicates a level of economic sophistication that facilitated complex commercial relationships. The ability to establish consistent standards for measuring goods and determining their value created a foundation for trade relationships that could span vast distances and involve multiple parties. This standardization was a crucial step in the development of complex economic systems. The credit systems that developed to facilitate Norte Chico trade reveal a society that had learned to think beyond immediate exchange. The ability to establish long-term economic relationships based on trust and mutual obligation created opportunities for more complex commercial arrangements. These credit systems, based on personal relationships and community reputation, created a foundation for economic growth that transcended the limitations of simple barter systems. The cultural exchange that accompanied Norte Chico trade created a cosmopolitan atmosphere in their settlements. The presence of foreign traders, the adoption of foreign artistic styles, and the integration of foreign religious practices all contributed to a cultural dynamism that enriched Norte Chico civilization. This cultural exchange created a society that was both distinctly local and connected to broader regional trends. The impact of Norte Chico trade on subsequent Andean civilizations cannot be overstated. The trade routes they established, the diplomatic protocols they developed, and the economic systems they created provided a foundation for the great empires that would later dominate the region. The peaceful exchange of goods and ideas that characterized Norte Chico trade created a model for regional interaction that would influence Andean civilization for thousands of years. As the sun set over the river valleys of Norte Chico, the smoke from cooking fires mixed with the dust raised by returning llama caravans, creating a haze that softened the outline of the great monuments. The daily rhythm of trade and exchange that characterized Norte Chico life was as regular as the agricultural cycles that governed their existence, creating a civilization that was both deeply rooted in local conditions and connected to the broader world beyond their immediate horizons. The great pyramids of Caral rose like sleeping giants from the desert floor, their stepped faces catching the first golden rays of dawn. In the valleys below, the sound of flowing water mixed with the gentle murmur of human voices, creating a symphony of life that would echo through the ages. This was Norte Chico in its prime, a civilization that had learned to transform the landscape of coastal Peru into a cradle of human achievement. The morning mist clung to the terraced fields like a soft blanket, slowly lifting to reveal the intricate network of irrigation channels that had become the lifeblood of this ancient society. Water, precious and carefully managed, flowed through stone-lined canals with the precision of a master craftsman's work. Each drop was guided, directed and cherished, for the people of Norte Chico understood that their survival depended not on conquest or plunder, but on their ability to work in harmony with the natural world. In the central plaza of Caral, the largest of the Norte Chico settlements, the morning ritual had begun. Figures moved with quiet purpose across the carefully swept stone surfaces, their sandaled feet making soft whispers against the ground. These were not the hurried movements of a people driven by fear or want, but the measured steps of a society that had found its rhythm, its balance, its place in the cosmic order. The architects of this golden age were not kings or conquerors, but farmers and fishermen who had learned to read the subtle languages of wind and water, soil and season. They had discovered that true wealth lay not in gold or silver, but in the patient accumulation of knowledge, the careful cultivation of relationships, and the steady building of structures that would endure long after their creators had returned to dust. As the sun climbed higher, the shadows of the great pyramids shifted and danced across the settlement below. These monuments, built without the wheel or beast of burden, stood as testament to the power of collective human effort. Every stone had been carried by hand, every level raised through the coordinated work of hundreds of people united by a common vision. The pyramids were not tombs for dead pharaohs, but living centers of community life, their terraced steps serving as gathering places for ceremonies, meetings, and the quiet contemplation of the cosmos. The golden age of Norte Chico was marked not by the clash of bronze swords or the thunder of war chariots, but by the gentle sound of cotton being spun into thread, the rhythmic pounding of quinoa being ground into flour, and the soft splash of nets being cast into the Pacific's fertile waters. This was a civilization that had chosen cooperation over conquest, sustainability over exploitation, wisdom over mere power. The leaders of Norte Chico were not crowned with gold or adorned with precious stones. They were recognized by their knowledge of the irrigation systems, their understanding of the seasonal patterns, their ability to coordinate the complex dance of agricultural and maritime activities that kept the civilization thriving. Their authority came not from divine mandate or hereditary right, but from their demonstrated competence in the essential tasks of survival and prosperity. In the workshops and courtyards of Caral, artisans worked with materials that spoke of far-reaching trade networks and sophisticated understanding of natural resources. Cotton, unknown to other civilizations of the time, was cultivated and processed with remarkable skill. The fibers were spun into thread, woven into textiles, and crafted into fishing nets of extraordinary strength and durability. These nets, when cast into the coastal waters, would return heavy with anchovies, sardines, and other fish that formed the protein foundation of the Norte Chico diet. The Golden Age was also marked by the development of what archaeologists would later call the Andean tradition, a way of life that emphasized reciprocity, community cooperation, and the careful management of resources. This tradition would survive the eventual decline of Norte Chico and influence Andean cultures for thousands of years to come. It was a philosophy that viewed the individual not as a separate entity competing for scarce resources, but as part of a larger web of relationships that included not only other humans, but the rivers, the mountains, the ocean, and the sky. The children of Norte Chico grew up in this atmosphere of cooperative abundance. They learned to read the signs of weather and season, to understand the complex relationships between water, soil, and crops. They watched their elders work the irrigation channels and learned that water was not simply a resource to be consumed, but a living force that required respect and careful stewardship. They played games that taught them the importance of working together, of sharing resources, of thinking not just about immediate needs, but about the long-term welfare of the community. As the day progressed and the sun reached its zenith, the settlements of Norte Chico came alive with the sounds of industry and commerce. In the markets, traders from the highlands brought precious materials from the Andes, colorful minerals, hard stones for tools, and exotic goods from distant valleys. In return, they received cotton textiles, dried fish, and the specialized knowledge of coastal living that the Norte Chico people had perfected over centuries. The Golden Age of Norte Chico was characterized by this spirit of exchange and mutual benefit. Unlike many ancient civilizations that grew through conquest and subjugation, Norte Chico expanded through the peaceful extension of trade networks and the sharing of technological innovations. Their influence spread not through the force of arms, but through the attractive power of their way of life, their prosperity, and their wisdom. The ancient paths that connected the Norte Chico settlements to the wider world were more than mere trade routes. They were arteries of culture, knowledge, and human connection that pulsed with the lifeblood of a thriving civilization. These pathways, worn smooth by countless feet over generations, wound through desert valleys and over mountain passes, carrying not just goods, but ideas, innovations, and the quiet wisdom of a people who had learned to prosper without war. The merchants of Norte Chico were not the aggressive traders of later civilizations, driven by the pursuit of quick profit. They were patient diplomats of commerce, understanding that true wealth came from the establishment of lasting relationships, built on trust and mutual benefit. When they set out from Caral or Aspero with their carefully packed loads of cotton textiles and dried fish, they carried with them the reputation of their civilization for fairness, quality, and reliability. Cotton was the golden thread that wove Norte Chico into the fabric of ancient America, while other civilizations were still learning to work with wild fibers. The people of Norte Chico had developed sophisticated techniques for cultivating, processing, and weaving cotton into textiles of remarkable quality. Their cotton plants, nurtured in the fertile valleys irrigated by their masterful canal systems, produced fibers that were stronger and more durable than any other textile available in the ancient world. The processing of cotton became an art form in Norte Chico. In the quiet hours of late afternoon, when the harsh sun had softened and the desert air had cooled, women would gather in the courtyards of their homes to spin the precious fibers into thread. The spinning was done not with the wheels that would later become common, but with simple spindles that required great skill and patience to master. The rhythm of the spinning created a gentle, meditative sound that seemed to synchronize with the heartbeat of the community itself. The cotton textiles of Norte Chico were prized throughout the ancient Americas for their exceptional quality and durability. These fabrics, woven with patterns that reflected the geometric precision of Norte Chico architecture, were not merely functional items, but works of art that carried the aesthetic sensibilities of their creators across vast distances. A piece of Norte Chico cotton might travel from the coastal settlements to the high Andes, where it would be treasured by mountain peoples who had never seen the ocean. The fishing industry of Norte Chico was equally sophisticated and far-reaching. In its influence, the coastal waters of Peru were among the richest in the world, thanks to the cold Humboldt current that brought nutrients from the deep ocean to the surface. The Norte Chico people had learned to harvest these riches with a combination of skill, technology, and deep understanding of marine ecosystems that would not be matched for thousands of years. Their fishing nets, woven from the same cotton that made their textiles famous, were marvels of engineering. These nets were not the simple affairs used by other coastal peoples, but complex constructions that required precise knowledge of fish behavior, water conditions, and seasonal patterns. The mesh size was carefully calculated to catch the desired species while allowing smaller fish to escape, ensuring the sustainability of the fishery for future generations. The fish caught in these nets were processed using techniques that turned them into valuable trade goods. The anchovies and sardines were dried in the desert sun, creating a protein-rich food that could be stored for long periods and transported over great distances. This dried fish became a staple food throughout the Andean region, providing essential nutrition to peoples who lived far from the ocean. The trade networks of Norte Chico extended far beyond the exchange of material goods. They were conduits for the spread of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. The irrigation techniques perfected in the coastal valleys were adapted and modified by highland peoples who faced different challenges in their mountainous environment. The cooperative social structures that made Norte Chico society so stable and prosperous were studied and emulated by other communities throughout the region. The economic prosperity of Norte Chico was built on a foundation of diversification and specialization. Different settlements within the civilization focused on different aspects of production and trade. Caral, the largest settlement, served as the central hub where goods from throughout the region were collected, processed, and redistributed. Aspero, located directly on the coast, specialized in fishing and marine products. Other settlements focused on agriculture, textile production, or the creation of specialized tools and implements. This specialization was made possible by the sophisticated transportation networks that connected the various settlements. goods were moved along well-maintained paths using human porters who had developed remarkable skills in carrying heavy loads over long distances. These porters were not simply laborers, but skilled professionals who understood the intricacies of trade routes, seasonal variations, and the delicate negotiations required to maintain peaceful relations with the various peoples encountered along the way. The economic system of Norte Chico was based on principles of reciprocity and mutual obligation rather than simple market exchange. When a trader from the highlands brought llama wool or precious stones to exchange for cotton textiles, the transaction was not merely a matter of calculating equivalent values. It was an affirmation of the ongoing relationship between communities, a recognition of mutual dependence, and a commitment to future cooperation. This system of reciprocal exchange created a web of relationships that extended throughout the Andean region. Communities that might have been isolated by geography or cultural differences were connected through the trade networks of Norte Chico. The cotton textiles and dried fish of the coastal settlements reached communities in the high Andes, while the products of the mountains, precious metals, exotic stones, and highland crops flowed down to the coast. The prosperity generated by these trade networks was not concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy merchants or rulers. Instead, it was distributed throughout the community in ways that strengthened social cohesion and ensured that all members of society shared in the benefits of economic success. The Great Pyramids and public buildings of Norte Chico were not built by slave labor or through the exploitation of conquered peoples, but through the cooperative efforts of a prosperous and confident community. The economic model developed by Norte Chico represented a fundamentally different approach to wealth creation than would be seen in later civilizations. Rather than seeking to accumulate resources through conquest or exploitation, they built their prosperity through patient cultivation of relationships, careful stewardship of natural resources, and the development of technologies that enhanced, rather than depleted, their environment. The spiritual life of Norte Chico flowed like the sacred waters of their irrigation channels, permeating every aspect of their existence with a quiet reverence that recognized the interconnectedness of all things. Their religion was not a separate realm of human experience, divorced from the practical concerns of daily life, but an integral part of their understanding of how to live in harmony with the natural and cosmic order. The Great Pyramids of Caral were not merely impressive monuments to human engineering, but sacred mountains created by human hands, places where the earthly and divine realms touched and merged. As the morning sun cast long shadows across the stepped faces of these artificial peaks, the people of Norte Chico would gather for ceremonies that honored the forces that sustained their civilization, the sun that warmed their crops, the water that flowed through their channels, the earth that yielded its bounty, and the ocean that provided its endless harvest. The religious practices of Norte Chico were characterized by a profound sense of gratitude and reciprocity. They understood that their prosperity was not the result of their own efforts alone, but depended on the cooperation of forces far greater than themselves. The sun, the rain, the fertile soil, the teeming ocean, all these were seen as generous beings that gave freely of their bounty, and the Norte Chico people felt a deep obligation to give back in return. This reciprocal relationship with the natural world was expressed through ceremonies and rituals that marked the important transitions of the agricultural and fishing cycles. When the cotton was planted, special ceremonies honored the earth spirits that would nurture the seeds. When the fish were most abundant, rituals acknowledged the ocean's generosity. When the harvest was gathered, Celebrations gave thanks for the abundance that would sustain the community through the coming year. The religious leaders of Norte Chico were not a separate priestly class set apart from the common people, but individuals who had demonstrated special skill in understanding the complex relationships between human activities and natural forces. They were often the same people who directed the irrigation systems, planned the agricultural cycles, and organized the fishing expeditions. Their authority in religious matters came from their proven competence in the practical tasks of survival and prosperity. The sacred architecture of Norte Chico reflected their understanding of the cosmos as a unified whole. The pyramids were built with careful attention to astronomical alignments, their orientations reflecting the movement of the sun, moon, and stars. The circular sunken plazas that surrounded the pyramids were designed to create acoustic effects that enhanced the power of ceremonial music and chanting. Every element of the sacred landscape was designed to reinforce the connection between human community and cosmic order. Music played a central role in the religious life of Norte Chico. Archaeological evidence suggests that they created sophisticated musical instruments, including flutes and other wind instruments that could produce complex harmonies. The sounds of these instruments, echoing from the sunken plazas and pyramid platforms, would have created an atmosphere of otherworldly beauty that transported participants beyond the ordinary concerns of daily life. The religious ceremonies of Norte Chico were not somber affairs marked by fear or supplication, but joyful celebrations of life and abundance. They reflected a worldview that saw the cosmos as fundamentally benevolent, a source of endless gifts that required only proper respect and reciprocity to ensure their continued flow. This optimistic spirituality was perfectly suited to a civilization that had learned to thrive through cooperation rather than conflict. The dead were honored in Norte Chico not as departed souls who had left the world behind, but as ancestors who remained part of the ongoing life of the community. They were buried within the settlements, often beneath the floors of houses or in special areas of the ceremonial centers. This practice reflected the belief that death was not an ending but a transformation, a movement from one form of participation in the community to another. The ancestors were thought to continue their interest in the welfare of their descendants, offering guidance and protection to those who honored their memory. This belief created a sense of continuity that extended far beyond the span of individual lifetimes, connecting each generation to those who had come before and those who would come after. The Great Pyramids themselves were seen as monuments to this continuity, physical embodiments of the accumulated wisdom and effort of countless generations. The spiritual practices of Norte Chico included forms of meditation and contemplation that sought to align individual consciousness with the rhythms of the natural world. These practices were not separate from practical activities, but were integrated into the work of farming, fishing, and craftsmanship. The careful attention required to maintain the irrigation channels, the patient skill needed to weave cotton into thread, the precise timing necessary for successful fishing. All these activities were seen as forms of spiritual discipline that cultivated awareness and harmony. The religious art of Norte Chico was characterized by geometric patterns and symbolic representations that reflected their understanding of cosmic order. These designs, found on textiles, pottery, and architectural elements, were not merely decorative, but served as visual teachings that communicated essential truths about the nature of reality. The spirals, circles, and intersecting lines that appeared repeatedly in their art represented the fundamental patterns that governed the movement of water. the growth of plants, and the cycles of the seasons. The spiritual life of Norte Chico was also marked by a deep respect for the feminine principle, recognized as the source of life and fertility. The earth itself was seen as a great mother who nurtured all living things, and the waters that flowed through their irrigation channels were understood as her life-giving milk. This reverence for the feminine was reflected in the important roles that women played in religious ceremonies and in the management of essential community resources. The religious practices of Norte Chico created a framework for understanding human existence that emphasized responsibility, gratitude, and interconnectedness. They taught that individual prosperity was inseparable from the welfare of the community, that human activities must be conducted in harmony with natural processes, and that the present moment was part of a vast continuum that extended from the distant past into the far future. As the sun set behind the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the people of Norte Chico would gather once more for the evening ceremonies. The sounds of flutes and voices would rise from the sacred plazas, carrying prayers of gratitude for the day's blessings and hopes for the morrow's continued abundance. In these moments of collective reverence, the artificial distinction between sacred and secular dissolved, and the people of Norte Chico experienced themselves as part of the eternal dance of creation itself. The daily rhythm of life in Norte Chico moved like a gentle river, flowing with the natural cycles of sun and season, shaped by the patient wisdom of generations who had learned to find abundance in the apparent emptiness of the desert coast. In the early morning hours, before the sun had risen high enough to bring the full heat of the day, the settlement would stir to life with the soft sounds of preparation and purposeful activity. The homes of Norte Chico were marvels of practical engineering designed to provide comfort and protection in the challenging environment of coastal Peru, built from stone and adobe. These structures were carefully oriented to take advantage of cooling breezes from the ocean while providing shelter from the harsh desert winds. The walls were thick enough to keep the interior cool during the blazing heat of midday, yet designed with openings that allowed the gentle movement of air throughout the living spaces. The architecture of Norte Chico reflected their sophisticated understanding of both practical and aesthetic concerns. The buildings were not merely functional shelters, but carefully crafted environments that enhanced the quality of life for their inhabitants. The proportions of rooms and courtyards were calculated to create pleasing visual harmonies, while the placement of windows and doorways was designed to frame views of the surrounding landscape and create connections between interior and exterior spaces. The furniture and household implements of Norte Chico were crafted with the same attention to both beauty and function that characterized their architecture. Stone, mortar, and pestles were shaped with elegant curves that made them as pleasant to look at as they were efficient to use. Storage containers were decorated with geometric patterns that reflected the mathematical precision of their irrigation systems. Every object in the home was created not just to serve a practical purpose, but to contribute to the overall aesthetic harmony of the living environment. The people of Norte Chico were skilled in a wide range of crafts that reflected their deep understanding of natural materials and processes. They were master weavers, creating textiles of extraordinary complexity and beauty from the cotton they cultivated in their irrigated fields. The weaving process itself was a communal activity that brought women together in the courtyards of their homes, where they would work and talk while their children played nearby. The textiles of Norte Chico were not merely functional items, but works of art that expressed the aesthetic sensibilities of their creators. The patterns woven into these fabrics were complex geometric designs that reflected the mathematical principles underlying their understanding of the cosmos. The colors were subtle and sophisticated, derived from natural dyes that produced soft, earthy tones that harmonized with the desert landscape. The cuisine of Norte Chico was based on the abundant resources of both land and sea, prepared with techniques that maximized both nutritional value and flavor. The foundation of their diet was the rich harvest of the Pacific Ocean, supplemented by the crops they grew in their irrigated fields. Fish were prepared in numerous ways, fresh, dried, or ground into nutritious meals that could be stored and transported over long distances. The agricultural products of Norte Chico included a variety of crops that were perfectly adapted to their environment. Cotton, of course, was their most important crop, but they also grew beans, squash, and other vegetables that provided essential nutrients. The cultivation of these crops required careful attention to the timing of planting and harvesting, as well as the precise management of irrigation water to ensure optimal growth. The children of Norte Chico grew up in an environment that encouraged learning and creativity. They were taught from an early age to observe the natural world carefully, to understand the relationships between different elements of their environment, and to appreciate the beauty that could be found in even the most practical activities. Education was not a separate activity conducted in special schools, but was integrated into the daily life of the community. The games and toys of Norte Chico children reflected the values and knowledge of their society. They played with miniature versions of the tools and implements used by adults, learning through play the skills they would need as productive members of the community. They created art projects that mimicked the geometric patterns found in adult textiles and architecture, developing their aesthetic sensibilities while learning about the mathematical principles that underlay their culture. The social structure of Norte Chico was based on principles of cooperation and mutual support rather than hierarchy and competition. Leadership roles were filled by individuals who had demonstrated competence in essential skills, and these roles were often rotated to ensure that power was shared rather than concentrated. The community operated as an extended family, with older members teaching, younger ones, and everyone contributing according to their abilities. The artistic achievements of Norte Chico extended beyond textiles and architecture to include sophisticated works in stone, bone, and other materials. Their sculptors created figurines and decorative objects that combined realistic representation with symbolic meaning. These works of art were not created for their own sake, but served important functions in religious ceremonies and social rituals. The musical traditions of Norte Chico were highly developed, with instruments and compositions that reflected their understanding of harmony and rhythm. The flutes and other wind instruments they created were capable of producing complex musical arrangements that enhanced the power of their religious ceremonies. Music was not entertainment in the modern sense, but an integral part of their spiritual and social life. The evening hours in Norte Chico were times of reflection and community gathering. As the heat of the day subsided and the desert air cooled, families would come together in their courtyards to share meals and stories. These gatherings were opportunities for the transmission of cultural knowledge, as older family members would tell stories that preserved the history and wisdom of their people. The storytelling traditions of Norte Chico were rich and complex, incorporating elements of history, mythology, and practical instruction. These stories served multiple functions. They preserved important information about agricultural techniques, fishing methods, and social customs. They provided entertainment, and strengthened social bonds, and they transmitted the values and worldview that held their society together. The cultural achievements of Norte Chico represented a unique synthesis of practical skill and artistic sensibility. They had learned to create beauty in the midst of functionality, to find harmony in the midst of challenge, and to build a civilization that enhanced rather than diminished the natural world around them. Their way of life demonstrated that human beings could prosper without destroying their environment, that communities could thrive without warfare, and that lasting achievements could be built through cooperation rather than competition. By the time Norte Chico reached its full flowering, around 2500 BCE, it had become something unprecedented in human history, a civilization that had achieved remarkable complexity and sophistication without the traditional markers of ancient power. There were no kings draped in gold, no armies marching in formation, no slave gangs laboring under the whip. Instead, there was something far more revolutionary, a society that had learned to thrive through the patient accumulation of knowledge, the careful cultivation of relationships, and the wise stewardship of resources. The settlement of Caral, the crown jewel of Norte Chico civilization, sprawled across the desert valley like a carefully planned garden, from the Great Pyramid that dominated the center of the settlement to the smallest residential structures on the periphery. Every building reflected the same principles of harmony and proportion. The urban planning was sophisticated beyond anything that would be seen again in the Americas for thousands of years, with residential areas, ceremonial spaces, and workshop districts arranged in a logical pattern that facilitated both privacy and community interaction. The population of Caral at its height may have reached several thousand people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at that time. Yet this was not a city in the modern sense, driven by commerce and industry, but something more like a sacred community where the practical and spiritual aspects of life were seamlessly integrated. The people who lived there were not anonymous urban dwellers, but members of an extended family who knew each other's names, shared each other's burdens, and celebrated each other's successes. The technological achievements of Norte Chico at its peak were remarkable not for their complexity, but for their elegance and sustainability. They had mastered the art of working with natural materials, stone, clay, cotton, and wood, in ways that enhanced rather than depleted their environment. Their tools were simple but perfectly designed for their intended purposes, and their techniques were refined through generations of patient experimentation and improvement. The irrigation systems of Norte Chico represented the pinnacle of ancient hydraulic engineering. The main canals that carried water from the rivers to the agricultural fields were supplemented by a network of smaller channels, retention basins, and distribution systems that ensured every drop of precious water was used to maximum advantage. The engineering required to maintain these systems was extraordinary, requiring constant attention to silting, erosion, and the delicate balance between water supply and demand. The agricultural productivity achieved by Norte Chico was remarkable, given the challenging environment in which they lived. The cotton they grew was not only abundant, but of exceptional quality, prized throughout the ancient Americas for its strength and durability. Their techniques for processing and preparing this cotton were sophisticated, involving multiple steps that transformed the raw fiber into threads suitable for weaving the complex textiles that were their civilization's greatest artistic achievement. The fishing industry of Norte Chico had evolved into a complex system that combined technological innovation with deep understanding of marine ecosystems. Their nets were not just tools for catching fish, but carefully designed instruments that allowed them to harvest the ocean's bounty while maintaining the sustainability of fish populations. The techniques they developed for processing and preserving fish created products that could be stored for long periods and transported over great distances. The social organization of Norte Chico at its peak reflected their fundamental commitment to cooperation and mutual support. Leadership was distributed among individuals who had demonstrated competence in essential skills, and decision-making was typically a collective process that sought consensus rather than domination. This system of governance was remarkably stable and effective, creating a society that could coordinate complex activities while maintaining social harmony. The religious and ceremonial life of Norte Chico reached its most elaborate expression during this period. The Great Pyramids served as focal points for ceremonies that brought together people from throughout the region, creating a sense of shared identity and common purpose. These ceremonies were not merely religious observances, but community celebrations that strengthened social bonds and reinforced the values that held their society together. The artistic achievements of Norte Chico at its height were extraordinary, reflecting a level of aesthetic sophistication that would not be equaled in the Americas for many centuries. Their textiles combined technical mastery with artistic vision, creating works that were both beautiful and functional. The geometric patterns woven into these fabrics reflected their understanding of mathematical principles and their ability to translate abstract concepts into visual form. The influence of Norte Chico extended far beyond the boundaries of their own settlements. Their trade networks connected them to communities throughout the Andean region, and their innovations in agriculture, textiles, and social organization were adopted and adapted by other peoples. They had become not just a successful civilization, but a source of inspiration and knowledge for the wider world. The intellectual achievements of Norte Chico were perhaps their greatest legacy. They had developed systems of knowledge that encompassed astronomy, mathematics, engineering, agriculture, and social organization. This knowledge was not written down in books or stored in libraries, but was embedded in their practices, their technologies, and their social institutions. It was a living knowledge that was constantly being refined and improved through practical application. The wisdom of Norte Chico was not the abstract wisdom of philosophers or priests, but the practical wisdom of people who had learned to live in harmony with their environment and with each other. They had discovered that true prosperity came not from the accumulation of material wealth, but from the creation of sustainable systems that could provide for human needs without destroying the natural world. As the sun set over the Pacific Ocean, casting long shadows across the Great Pyramids of Caral, the people of Norte Chico could look with satisfaction on what they had accomplished. They had built a civilization that was both prosperous and sustainable, both sophisticated and harmonious. They had proven that human beings could create complex societies without warfare, that they could achieve remarkable technological feats without destroying their environment, and that they could build lasting institutions based on cooperation rather than coercion. The height of Norte Chico civilization represented a unique moment in human history when a people had achieved the delicate balance between human ambition and natural limits. They had learned to live within the carrying capacity of their environment while still achieving remarkable cultural and technological sophistication. Their example offered a vision of what human civilization could be when guided by wisdom, restraint, and respect for the natural world. Yet even as Norte Chico reached its zenith, subtle changes were beginning to appear that would eventually challenge the foundations of their remarkable civilization. The environmental conditions that had made their success possible were slowly shifting, and the delicate balance they had maintained for over 1,000 years was starting to come under pressure. The golden age of Norte Chico was approaching its end, though those who lived through it could not have imagined the changes that lay ahead. The great terraces that had once channeled water with mathematical precision began to show the first signs of neglect. Not abandonment, not yet, but a subtle shift in the rhythm of maintenance that had sustained Norte Chico for over 1,000 years. The priests who had once calculated the precise moments for irrigation now found themselves consulting the stars with growing uncertainty, their ancient formulas no longer matching the patterns of rain and drought that swept across the coastal desert. In the shadow of Caral's Great Pyramid, the council chambers that had once echoed with the confident voices of administrators now carried undertones of concern. The tribute lists that arrived from distant settlements spoke of smaller harvests, of communities struggling to maintain their quotas of cotton and food. The intricate network of reciprocal obligations that had bound the Norte Chico settlements together for generations began to show strain, like a tapestry pulled too tightly at its edges. The climate itself seemed to be shifting, though the changes came so gradually that they were barely perceptible to any single generation. The coastal fog that had once rolled inland with reliable regularity now arrived less frequently, leaving the carefully tended gardens thirsting for moisture. The seasonal floods that had nourished the river valleys began to vary more dramatically, sometimes bringing devastating torrents, other times trickling to levels that barely sustained the ancient irrigation channels. Yet even as these challenges mounted, the people of Norte Chico displayed the same ingenuity that had built their civilization. They dug deeper wells, modified their agricultural techniques, and developed new varieties of crops that could better withstand the changing conditions. The master builders who had raised the Great Pyramids now turned their skills to creating more sophisticated water management systems, attempting to capture and store every precious drop of moisture that fell from the increasingly unpredictable skies. The ceremonial centers that had once been the beating heart of Norte Chico society began to reflect these mounting pressures. The great plazas that had hosted thousands during the most important festivals now saw smaller gatherings, as communities struggled to spare the labor needed for such elaborate celebrations. The intricate religious ceremonies that had once reinforced the social bonds binding the confederation together became more focused on pleading with the gods for favorable weather and abundant harvests. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals a fascinating paradox. Even as the overall prosperity of Norte Chico began to decline, certain aspects of their material culture reached new heights of sophistication. The textiles produced during these challenging times show an unprecedented level of artistry and technical skill, as if the weavers were pouring their cultural knowledge into their work with an intensity born of uncertainty. The pottery became more elaborate, the musical instruments more refined, as if beauty itself had become a form of resistance against the growing difficulties. The merchants who had once traveled the established trade routes with confident regularity now found themselves adapting to new realities. The paths that had connected the Norte Chico settlements to the highland communities became more treacherous as political relationships shifted and resources became scarcer. The exotic goods that had once flowed freely between the coast and the mountains, the colorful feathers, the precious stones, the specialized tools now commanded higher prices and required more complex negotiations in the great centers like Caral and Supe. The administrative burden of managing these challenges fell increasingly on smaller groups of skilled specialists. The bureaucratic systems that had once distributed authority across a wide network of officials became more centralized, as communities sought to maximize their efficiency in the face of growing difficulties. The careful balance between local autonomy and central coordination that had characterized Norte Chico governance began to tip toward more direct control from the major centers. The religious practices that had provided spiritual and social cohesion for Norte Chico society began to evolve in response to these pressures. The gods who had once been petitioned for abundance and prosperity now found themselves asked more frequently for protection and endurance. The rituals that had celebrated the cyclical nature of agricultural success became more focused on divination and attempts to understand the will of increasingly unpredictable divine forces. Yet even as these changes accumulated, the fundamental character of Norte Chico society remained intact. The peaceful nature that had distinguished them from other early civilizations persisted, even under stress. There is no archaeological evidence of increasing warfare or internal violence during this period of decline. Instead, the Norte Chico people seemed to turn inward, focusing their energies on adaptation and survival rather than conflict and conquest. The children born during this period of transition grew up in a world subtly different from that of their grandparents. They learned the same fundamental skills: the cultivation of cotton and food crops, the management of irrigation systems, the creation of textiles and tools, but they also learned new lessons about flexibility and resilience. The stories they heard from their elders spoke not only of the great achievements of the past, but also of the importance of adapting to changing circumstances. In the workshops where skilled artisans had once created goods for trade throughout the region, there was a gradual shift toward producing items for local consumption. The specialized crafts that had once marked Norte Chico as a center of innovation and excellence began to be practiced more for community needs than for external exchange. This inward turn reflected not a loss of skill or ambition, but a practical adaptation to new economic realities. The astronomical observations that had been so crucial to Norte Chico's agricultural success became more critical than ever as the climate patterns shifted. The priest astronomers, who had once confidently predicted the optimal times for planting and harvesting, now found themselves conducting more frequent and detailed observations, seeking to understand the new patterns emerging in the sky and on the earth. Their stone observatories, already ancient by this time, remained active centers of scientific inquiry even as other aspects of the culture began to change. The social hierarchies that had organized Norte Chico society for generations began to show signs of stress as well. The elaborate system of reciprocal obligations that had bound farmers to craftsmen, local leaders to regional authorities, and communities to ceremonial centers required a certain level of surplus production to function effectively. As that surplus diminished, the social contracts that had maintained order and cooperation required renegotiation and adaptation. The transformation of Norte Chico was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual metamorphosis that unfolded over several centuries. Like the slow changing of seasons, the shift was barely perceptible from year to year, yet undeniable when measured across generations. The Great Pyramid at Caral, which had stood as a testament to human achievement for over a millennium, began to show signs of where that went beyond the normal weathering of time. The maintenance crews that had once kept the monumental architecture in pristine condition found their numbers dwindling as communities diverted labor to more pressing needs. The elaborate system of ramps, stairways, and platforms that had made the ceremonial centers accessible to thousands of pilgrims began to show cracks and erosion, not from neglect, but from the simple mathematics of a civilization that could no longer afford to dedicate vast resources to maintaining structures, whose primary purpose was ceremonial rather than practical. The cotton fields that had once stretched in neat, irrigated rows across the river valleys began to give way to different crops, hardier varieties that could survive with less water and care. The skilled farmers who had perfected the cultivation of the long staple cotton that had made Norte Chico famous throughout the region found themselves experimenting with new agricultural techniques suited to a harsher climate. The beautiful textiles that had been their civilization's signature continued to be produced, but in smaller quantities and with threads of necessarily different quality in the administrative centers. The complex record-keeping systems that had tracked tribute, trade, and seasonal activities began to simplify. The intricate Quipu systems that had once recorded detailed information about every aspect of Norte Chico society now focused on more essential data, food stores, population counts, and resource allocation. The bureaucratic apparatus that had once managed a complex confederation of settlements gradually streamlined itself to serve the needs of a more decentralized collection of communities. The pilgrimage routes that had once brought thousands of visitors to the great ceremonial centers now carried fewer travelers. The festivals that had once required months of preparation and had drawn participants from across the region became more localized affairs. The great plazas that had hosted elaborate ceremonies now saw smaller gatherings, though the reverence and spiritual significance of these events remained unchanged. The sacred mountains that had watched over Norte Chico civilization for millennia continued to receive offerings and prayers, though the scale of the ceremonies had necessarily diminished. The merchant networks that had once connected Norte Chico, two communities throughout the Andes, began to reorganize around new realities. The exotic goods that had once been common in the markets, the tropical feathers, the highland metals, the marine shells became rare and precious. Trade became more focused on essential items rather than luxury goods, and the elaborate gift exchanges that had reinforced political alliances gave way to more practical arrangements. Yet even as the grand scale of Norte Chico society diminished, the fundamental knowledge and skills that had built the civilization did not disappear. The techniques for irrigation, the methods of textile production, the astronomical observations, the architectural principles, all of these continued to be practiced and passed down, though in modified forms suited to new circumstances. The libraries of knowledge that existed in the minds and hands of skilled practitioners remained intact, ready to be called upon when conditions might once again favor their full expression. The communities that had once been satellites of the great centers began to develop more autonomous identities. Villages that had once sent their best products to Caral or Supe now kept more of their production for local use. The specialized crafts that had once been concentrated in the major centers began to spread to smaller settlements, as communities sought to become more self-sufficient in the face of uncertain trade connections. The religious practices that had been centered on the Great Pyramids and ceremonial complexes began to adapt to smaller, more intimate settings. The rituals that had once required the participation of hundreds of people were modified to be meaningful for smaller groups. The astronomical observations that had been conducted from the great observatories began to be practiced from simpler structures, though the accuracy and importance of these observations remained unchanged. The environmental challenges that triggered this transformation continued to evolve. The climate patterns that had once supported the intensive Agriculture of Norte Chico's golden age gave way to conditions that favored different types of land use. The river valleys that had once supported dense populations began to support smaller, more dispersed communities. The coastal areas that had once been centers of trade and production began to be used differently, as communities adapted to new ecological realities. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals a fascinating process of cultural adaptation. The pottery styles that had been characteristic of Norte Chico's civilization began to evolve into new forms that reflected changing needs and circumstances. The architectural techniques that had been used to create monumental structures were adapted. For smaller, more practical buildings, the artistic traditions that had flourished in the great centers found new expression in the humbler settings of village life. The social hierarchies that had organized Norte Chico society began to flatten, as the economic base that had supported elaborate stratification diminished. The priestly class that had once wielded significant authority through their control of astronomical knowledge and ceremonial activities found their role evolving toward more practical functions. The merchant class that had once accumulated wealth through long-distance trade adapted to serve more localized markets. The skilled craftsmen who had once created luxury goods for elite consumption began to focus on items needed by their own communities. The knowledge systems that had been the pride of Norte Chico civilization, the astronomical observations, the hydraulic engineering, the textile production, the architectural techniques began to be preserved and transmitted in new ways. The formal institutions that had once been responsible for maintaining and developing this knowledge gave way to more informal networks of teachers and students. The specialized schools that had once trained the next generation of experts were replaced by family-based apprenticeships and community-based learning. The oral traditions that had preserved Norte Chico's history and cultural identity began to adapt to new circumstances. The epic stories that had once celebrated the great achievements of the past were modified to emphasize lessons about adaptation and resilience. The myths that had once explained the cosmic order began to incorporate new understandings about the nature of change and impermanence. The songs that had once been performed in the great plazas were adapted for smaller venues and more intimate audiences. The children who grew up during this period of transition learned a different set of skills than their ancestors. They learned not only the traditional crafts and techniques that had defined Norte Chico civilization, but also new abilities suited to a more challenging environment. They learned to be more flexible, more adaptable, more self-reliant. They learned to value sustainability over grandeur, resilience over specialization, cooperation over competition. The landscape itself began to change as the intensive agriculture that had shaped it for centuries gave way to new patterns of land use. The terraces that had once channeled water with mathematical precision were modified or abandoned as communities adapted to different hydrological conditions. The carefully planned settlements that had once dotted the river valleys were consolidated or relocated as populations shifted in response to changing circumstances. The spiritual life of Norte Chico society continued to evolve throughout this period of transformation. The gods who had once been petitioned for abundance and prosperity were now asked for wisdom and endurance. The rituals that had once celebrated the predictable cycles of agricultural success were modified to acknowledge the reality of unpredictable change. The sacred sites that had once been centers of elaborate ceremonies continued to be revered, though the nature of the reverence had necessarily changed. The Great Pyramid at Caral stood in the growing silence like a monument to dreams that had once seemed permanent. The morning mist that rolled in from the Pacific still caressed its ancient stones, but the sounds that had once accompanied dawn, the voices of workers preparing for the day, the rustle of cotton garments, the distant calls of merchants arriving, with their goods, had faded to whispers of wind through empty chambers. The abandonment of the great centers was not a single event, but a gradual process that unfolded over generations. Families who had lived in the shadow of the pyramids for centuries began to make the difficult decision to seek new homes in smaller settlements, where the changing climate and economic conditions offered better prospects for survival. The skilled craftsmen who had once created the finest textiles and tools in the region began to pack their workshops and carry their knowledge to communities that could still support their work. The priests who had once conducted elaborate ceremonies in the great plazas found their congregations dwindling as people focused their energies on the practical challenges of daily survival. The astronomical observations that had once guided the agricultural calendar continued to be made, but from simpler structures and with fewer resources. The knowledge that had once been preserved in the great libraries of the ceremonial centers was gradually dispersed to smaller communities, where it was maintained by individuals who understood its value even if they could not always apply it. On the same grand scale, the irrigation systems that had once supported thousands of people began to be modified or abandoned as communities adapted to new demographic realities. The canals that had once carried life-giving water to vast agricultural terraces were allowed to silt up in some areas while being intensively maintained in others. The careful balance between water management and population that had sustained Norte Chico civilization for over a millennium was gradually recalibrated to serve smaller, more dispersed communities. The administrative buildings that had once housed the complex bureaucracy of Norte Chico governance began to serve different purposes. Some were converted to storage facilities for communities that needed to carefully manage their resources. Others were modified to serve as workshops where essential crafts could be practiced. A few were simply abandoned, their carefully constructed rooms left to the slow work of wind and rain. The trade networks that had once connected Norte Chico to the wider world began to reorganize around new centers of activity. The routes that had once brought exotic goods to the great markets of Caral and Supe were redirected to serve communities that could still participate in interregional exchange. The merchant families who had once accumulated wealth through long-distance trade adapted their skills to serve smaller, more localized markets. The artistic traditions that had flourished in the great centers continued to evolve, though in new contexts. The master weavers who had once created elaborate textiles for ceremonial purposes began to focus on producing practical goods for daily use. The musicians who had once performed in the great plazas began to adapt their repertoires for smaller venues and more intimate audiences. The skilled architects who had once designed monumental structures began to apply their knowledge to creating smaller, more efficient buildings suited to the needs of smaller communities. The knowledge systems that had been the foundation of Norte Chico civilization were preserved and transmitted in new ways. The astronomical observations that had once been conducted from great observatories were continued by individuals who understood their importance even if they lacked the resources to maintain elaborate instruments. The hydraulic engineering techniques that had once supported intensive agriculture were adapted for smaller scale applications. The textile production methods that had once created luxury goods for elite consumption were modified to serve the needs of ordinary families. The social hierarchies that had organized Norte Chico society began to flatten as the economic base that had supported elaborate stratification diminished. The priestly class that had once wielded significant authority through their control of astronomical knowledge and ceremonial activities found their role evolving toward more practical functions. The merchant class that had once accumulated wealth through long-distance trade adapted to serve more localized markets. The skilled craftsmen who had once created luxury goods for elite consumption began to focus on items needed by their own communities. The environmental challenges that had triggered this transformation continued to shape the landscape, the climate. Patterns that had once supported the intensive agriculture of Norte Chico's golden age gave way to conditions that favored different types of land use. The river valleys that had once supported dense populations began to support smaller, more dispersed communities. The coastal areas that had once been centers of trade and production began to be used differently as communities adapted to new ecological realities. The spiritual life of the remaining communities continued to evolve throughout this period of transformation. The gods who had once been petitioned for abundance and prosperity were now asked for wisdom and endurance. The rituals that had once celebrated the predictable cycles of agricultural success were modified to acknowledge the reality of unpredictable change. The sacred sites that had once been centers of elaborate ceremonies continued to be revered, though the nature of the reverence had necessarily changed. The children who grew up during this period of transformation learned a different set of skills than their ancestors. They learned not only the traditional crafts and techniques that had defined Norte Chico civilization, but also new abilities suited to a more challenging environment. They learned to be more flexible, more adaptable, more self-reliant. They learned to value sustainability over grandeur, resilience over specialization, cooperation over competition. The landscape itself bore witness to these changes. The terraces that had once channeled water with mathematical precision were modified or abandoned as communities adapted to different hydrological conditions. The carefully planned settlements that had once dotted the river valleys were consolidated or relocated as populations shifted in response to changing circumstances. The monuments that had once proclaimed the greatness of Norte Chico civilization began to weather and erode, their stones slowly returning to the earth from which they had been raised. Yet even as the physical structures of Norte Chico's civilization crumbled, the knowledge and skills that had created them did not disappear entirely. The techniques for irrigation, the methods of textile production, the astronomical observations, the architectural principles, all of these continued to be practiced and passed down, though in modified forms suited to new circumstances. The libraries of knowledge that existed in the minds and hands of skilled practitioners remained intact, ready to be called upon when conditions might once again favor their full expression. The oral traditions that had preserved Norte Chico's history and cultural identity began to adapt to new circumstances as well. The epic stories that had once celebrated the great achievements of the past were modified to emphasize lessons about adaptation and resilience. The myths that had once explained the cosmic order began to incorporate new understandings about the nature of change and impermanence. The songs that had once been performed in the great plazas were adapted for smaller venues and more intimate audiences. The merchant networks that had once connected Norte Chico to communities throughout the Andes began to reorganize around new realities. The exotic goods that had once been common in the markets, the tropical feathers, the highland metals, the marine shells became rare and precious. Trade became more focused on essential items rather than luxury goods, and the elaborate gift exchanges that had reinforced political alliances gave way to more practical arrangements. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals a fascinating process of cultural adaptation. The pottery styles that had been characteristic of Norte Chico civilization began to evolve into new forms that reflected changing needs and circumstances. The architectural techniques that had been used to create monumental structures were adapted for smaller, more practical buildings. The artistic traditions that had flourished in the great centers found new expression in the humbler settings of village life. The communities that had once been satellites of the great centers began to develop more autonomous identities. Villagers that had once sent their best products to Caral or Supe now kept more of their production for local use. The specialized crafts that had once been concentrated in the major centers began to spread to smaller settlements. As communities sought to become more self-sufficient in the face of uncertain trade connections, the religious practices that had been centered on the great pyramids and ceremonial complexes began to adapt to smaller, more intimate settings. The rituals that had once required the participation of hundreds of people were modified to be meaningful for smaller groups. The astronomical observations that had been conducted from the great observatories began to be practiced from simpler structures, though the accuracy and importance of these observations remained unchanged. The administrative systems that had once coordinated the activities of thousands of people across a vast territory began to simplify and decentralize. The complex record-keeping systems that had tracked tribute, trade, and seasonal activities were modified to serve the needs of smaller communities. The bureaucratic apparatus that had once managed a complex confederation of settlements gradually streamlined itself to serve the needs of a more decentralized collection of communities. As the great centers slowly emptied, the monuments they left behind began their own slow transformation. The pyramids that had once been the focus of elaborate ceremonies became silent witnesses to the passage of time. The plazas that had once echoed with the sounds of thousands of people began to fill with wind-blown sand and the occasional call of desert birds. The canals that had once carried life-giving water to vast agricultural terraces began to crumble and fill with sediment. Yet even in their abandonment, these structures retained a kind of dignity. The builders who had raised them had worked with such skill and precision that they continued to stand even after the society that had created them had moved on. The stones that had been so carefully cut and fitted remained in place, bearing witness to human achievement even as the humans who had achieved it sought new ways to live in a changing world. The process of abandonment was gradual and in its way orderly. Communities did not flee in panic, but rather made careful, considered decisions about when and how to relocate. Essential items were carried to new settlements, while less portable goods were left behind. Sacred objects were carefully removed from the ceremonial centers and taken to new places of worship. The transition was managed with the same attention to detail and concern for community welfare that had characterized Norte Chico civilization throughout its long history. The knowledge that had been accumulated over more than a millennium was not lost, but rather dispersed and adapted. The skilled practitioners who had once worked in the great centers carried their expertise to smaller communities, where it was modified to serve new needs. The young people who might once have been trained in the specialized schools of the ceremonial centers learned their skills through family networks and community-based apprenticeships. The oral traditions that had preserved historical knowledge were adapted to new circumstances while maintaining their essential content. The social networks that had once connected the great centers to their dependent communities began to reorganize around new patterns. The relationships of tribute and reciprocity that had bound the Confederation together gave way to more flexible arrangements based on mutual aid and shared resources. The hierarchies that had once organized society began to flatten as communities became more egalitarian in their internal structure. The specialized roles that had once been necessary for managing complex institutions were adapted to serve the needs of smaller, more integrated communities. The environmental conditions that had triggered this transformation continued to evolve. The climate patterns that had made the intensive agriculture of Norte Chico's golden age possible gave way to conditions that favored different types of land use. The river valleys that had once supported dense populations began to support smaller, more dispersed communities. The coastal areas that had once been centers of trade and production began to be used differently, as communities adapted to new ecological realities. As the years passed and the great centers stood empty, they began to be reclaimed by the natural world. Sand drifted into the abandoned rooms, weeds grew in the cracks between stones, and small animals made their homes in the structures that had once housed thousands of people. The transformation was slow but inexorable, a reminder that all human achievements are temporary and that the earth itself is patient in its reclamation of what was taken from it. Yet even as the physical structures of Norte Chico's civilization crumbled, the ideas and innovations that had created them lived on. The techniques for managing water in a desert environment, the methods for creating textiles from cotton fiber, the principles of architectural design that could withstand earthquakes, all of these continued to influence the development of later civilizations in the region. The knowledge that had been accumulated over more than a millennium was not lost but rather transformed and adapted to serve new purposes in new contexts. The people who had once called the great centers home did not disappear but rather dispersed to form new communities throughout the region. They carried with them the skills and knowledge that had made Norte Chico civilization possible, and they continued to practice these skills in modified forms suited to their new circumstances. The cultural traditions that had defined their identity were preserved and adapted, ensuring that the essential character of Norte Chico civilization would survive even as its physical manifestations crumbled into dust. The transformation of Norte Chico from a thriving civilization to a collection of abandoned ruins was not a failure, but rather a natural process of adaptation to changing circumstances. The people who had built this remarkable society had demonstrated extraordinary skill in managing their environment and organizing their communities for more than a millennium. When conditions changed and their traditional way of life was no longer sustainable, they demonstrated the same flexibility and wisdom that had enabled them to build their civilization in the first place. The legacy of Norte Chico would not be found in the monuments they left behind, impressive as those monuments were. Rather, it would be found in the knowledge and skills they had developed, the innovations they had created, and the example they had set for how human communities could organize themselves to thrive in challenging environments. The techniques they had developed for irrigation, the methods they had created for textile production, the principles they had discovered for architectural design, all of these would influence the development of later civilizations throughout the Americas. The story of Norte Chico's transformation from a thriving civilization to a collection of abandoned ruins was not unique in human history. Many great civilizations have risen and fallen, adapted and transformed in response to changing circumstances. What made Norte Chico unique was the peaceful nature of their society, the sophistication of their environmental management, and the wisdom they demonstrated in adapting to change. Their legacy would be found not in conquest or domination, but in the example they set for how human communities could thrive. in harmony with their environment and with each other, as the sun set over the empty plazas and silent pyramids of Caral. The wind carried with it the whispers of a civilization that had once flourished in this place. The stones that had been so carefully cut and fitted by skilled hands remained in place, bearing witness to human achievement, even as the humans who had achieved it had moved on to new challenges and new opportunities. The great experiment of Norte Chico civilization had come to an end, but its influence would continue to shape the development of human society for generations to come. The transformation that had overtaken Norte Chico was not a collapse, but rather a metamorphosis, a changing of forms that preserved the essential knowledge and skills that had made their civilization possible. The people who had once lived in the great centers had not disappeared, but rather dispersed to form new communities throughout the region, carrying with them the wisdom they had accumulated over more than a millennium. The techniques they had developed, the innovations they had created, and the example they had set would continue to influence the development of human civilization long after their monuments had crumbled into dust in the growing twilight. As the last light of day faded from the ancient stones, the Great Pyramid at Caral stood as a testament to the enduring power of human creativity and ingenuity. The civilization that had built it had passed into history, but the knowledge and skills that had made it possible lived on in the hands and minds of their descendants. The story of Norte Chico was not ending, but rather transforming, like the civilization itself, into something new and different, but still recognizably connected to its ancient roots. The wind that blew across the empty plazas carried with it the memory of voices that had once filled these spaces with life and purpose. The sand that drifted into the abandoned rooms bore witness to the passage of time and the inevitability of change. The stars that appeared in the darkening sky had once been observed by skilled astronomers who had used their knowledge to guide the development of one of the world's earliest civilizations. All of these elements, the wind, the sand, the stars, would continue their eternal dance long after the last traces of Norte Chico had been erased from the earth. Yet even as the physical structures of Norte Chico civilization crumbled and weathered, the ideas and innovations that had created them would continue to influence the development of human society. The techniques for managing water in a desert environment, the methods for creating textiles from plant fibers, the principles of architectural design that could withstand natural disasters, all of these would be passed down through generations of skilled practitioners who understood their value even if they could not always apply them on the same grand scale. The transformation of Norte Chico from a thriving civilization to a collection of ruins was not a tragedy, but rather a natural process of adaptation and renewal. The people who had built this remarkable society had demonstrated extraordinary wisdom in creating institutions and practices that could sustain themselves for more than a millennium. When conditions changed and their traditional way of life was no longer viable, they had demonstrated the same flexibility and intelligence that had enabled them to build their civilization in the first place. Their legacy would be found not in the monuments they left behind, but in the knowledge they had preserved and the example they had set for how human communities could organize themselves to thrive in challenging environments. As the night deepened and the stars appeared in their familiar patterns, the ancient observatories of Norte Chico stood empty but not forgotten. The knowledge that had been accumulated through centuries of careful observation would continue to be preserved and transmitted, though in new forms and through new channels. The wisdom that had guided the development of one of the world's earliest civilizations would continue to influence the development of human society, ensuring that the essential insights of Norte Chico would never be completely lost. The story of Norte Chico's transformation was drawing to a close, but the influences and innovations that had made their civilization possible would continue to shape the development of human society for generations to come. The techniques they had developed, the knowledge they had accumulated, and the example they had set would be preserved and transmitted through the dispersed communities that had once been part of their great confederation. The civilization that had flourished in the valleys of coastal Peru for more than a millennium was transforming into something new, but it was not disappearing. Like the river that had given it life, it was simply changing course, carrying its essential character forward into an uncertain but promising future. In the silence that now filled the great plazas and empty chambers of Caral, there was a sense of completion rather than loss. The civilization that had built these remarkable structures had accomplished what it had set out to do. It had created a society that could sustain itself for more than a millennium without warfare or environmental destruction. It had developed innovations in agriculture, architecture, and social organization that would influence the development of human civilization for generations to come. It had demonstrated that human communities could organize themselves to thrive in challenging environments while maintaining peaceful relationships with their neighbors. The transformation that was now overtaking Norte Chico was not an ending, but rather a continuation of the same process of adaptation and innovation that had created their civilization in the first place. As the moon rose over the silent pyramids and empty plazas, casting long shadows across the ancient stones, the legacy of Norte Chico's civilization was not diminished, but rather transformed. The knowledge and skills that had made their society possible were being preserved and transmitted through new channels and in new forms. The innovations they had created were being adapted to serve new purposes in new contexts. The example they had set for peaceful coexistence and environmental stewardship was being carried forward by the communities that had once been part of their great confederation. The civilization that had flourished in the valleys of coastal Peru was not ending, but rather beginning a new chapter in its long and remarkable story. The transformation that had overtaken Norte Chico was complete, but the influences and innovations that had made their civilization possible would continue to shape the development of human society for generations to come. The techniques they had developed for managing water in a desert environment would be adapted and refined by later civilizations throughout the Americas. The methods they had created for producing textiles from plant fibers would influence the development of textile production throughout the world. The principles of architectural design they had discovered would be incorporated into building practices that would endure for centuries. The social innovations they had created would serve as models for how human communities could organize themselves to thrive in challenging environments while maintaining peaceful relationships with their neighbors. As the night deepened and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, the story of Norte Chico civilization was transforming from history into legend. The people who had once lived in the great centers had dispersed to form new communities throughout the region, carrying with them the knowledge and skills that had made their civilization possible. The techniques they had developed, the innovations they had created, and the example they had set would continue to influence the development of human civilization long after their monuments had crumbled into dust. The civilization that had flourished in the valleys of coastal Peru for more than a millennium was not disappearing, but rather spreading its influence throughout the wider world, ensuring that its essential insights and innovations would never be completely lost in the silence that now filled the great plazas and empty chambers of the Norte Chico ceremonial centers. There was a sense of profound completion. The civilization that had built these remarkable structures had accomplished something extraordinary. It had created a society that had sustained itself for more than a millennium without warfare or environmental destruction. It had developed innovations in agriculture, architecture, and social organization that would influence the development of human civilization for generations to come. It had demonstrated that human communities could organize themselves to thrive in challenging environments while maintaining peaceful relationships with their neighbors and stewarding their natural resources responsibly. The transformation that was now complete was not an ending, but rather the beginning of a new phase in the long and remarkable story of human civilization itself. The wind that blew across the empty plazas carried with it the memory of a civilization that had once flourished in this place, and as it moved on across the landscape, it carried those memories to new places and new communities that would preserve and adapt them for future generations. The knowledge and skills that had made Norte Chico civilization possible were not lost, but rather transformed and dispersed, ready to influence the development of human society in ways that were only beginning to be understood. The story of Norte Chico was not ending, but rather transforming, like the civilization itself, into something new and different, but still recognizably connected to its ancient roots and eternal dreams. The great plazas fell into silence, and the winds of the coastal desert began their patient work of erasure. Centuries folded into millennia, and the monuments of Norte Chico became hills clothed in sand and scrub vegetation. The pyramids, once gleaming white in the Peruvian sun, took on the muted colors of the earth itself, brown, tan, and gray, indistinguishable from the natural landscape that surrounded them. Time moved differently in this forgotten realm. The Supe River continued its ancient course, carrying its precious waters from the Andes to the sea, but the canals that had once channeled its flow lay buried beneath layers of sediment. The cotton fields that had clothed a civilization gave way to sparse grasses and thorny shrubs. The fishing nets that had pulled abundance from the Pacific were replaced by the simple boats of coastal peoples, who had no memory of the great centers that once dominated this shore. Yet beneath the surface, the civilization slept rather than died. The stone foundations of their temples remained solid, anchored deep in the earth. The careful alignments of their buildings continued to mark the passage of celestial bodies across the sky. The fire pits where offerings had burned for generations retained their circular forms, waiting patiently for archaeologists who would not arrive for thousands of years in the highlands. Other civilizations rose and fell the Chavin with their jaguar gods, the Mocha with their pyramid builders, the Nazca with their desert lines. Each left their mark upon the archaeological record, drawing the attention of scholars and treasure seekers alike. But Norte Chico remained hidden, its secrets preserved by the very obscurity that time had granted it. The Spanish conquistadors swept through Peru in the 16th century, their chroniclers recording the great cities of the Inca and the remnants of earlier peoples. They passed through the Supe Valley, noting the fertility of the land and the potential for agriculture. But they saw only low hills where pyramids lay buried. The colonial period brought new peoples to the Coast African slaves, Spanish settlers, mixed populations seeking their fortune in the New World, but none recognized the significance of the mounds that dotted the landscape. Indigenous peoples of the region maintained fragments of memory, passed down through generations in the form of stories and place names. They spoke of the old ones who had built great works, but these tales were dismissed by European scholars as folklore, unworthy of serious consideration. The scientific revolution that swept Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries brought new methods of understanding the past, but these were focused on the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome, not the supposedly primitive peoples of the Americas. The 19th century brought the first stirrings of archaeological interest to Peru. Scholars began to document the magnificent ruins of Machu Picchu and other Inca sites, marveling at the sophistication of these lost civilizations, but their attention remained focused on the mountain regions where stone construction had survived. The centuries more visibly, the coastal desert with its buried secrets remained largely unexplored. Local inhabitants of the Supe Valley went about their daily lives, farming the fertile soil and fishing the abundant waters, largely unaware that they walked above one of the world's most significant archaeological sites. Children played on the hills that were actually pyramid platforms, their laughter echoing across spaces where once the solemn ceremonies of an ancient people had taken place. Farmers plowed fields that contained the remnants of irrigation systems thousands of years old, their modern furrows, crossing and recrossing the ancient channels that had once fed a civilization. The low mounds that dotted the landscape were so numerous and seemingly natural that they attracted little attention from the outside world. Unlike the dramatic cliff-top citadels of the Inca or the towering stone heads of Easter Island, the architecture of Norte Chico was subtle, integrated into the landscape in ways that made it nearly invisible to casual observation. This very quality that had made it so harmonious with its environment during its heyday now served to protect it from discovery and exploitation. Photography began to document the Peruvian landscape in the early 20th century, but the camera's eye, like the human gaze, was drawn to the dramatic and the obvious. The buried pyramids of Norte Chico appeared in these images as unremarkable hills, their significance recognizable only to those who knew what to look for. Maps of the region marked rivers and modern settlements, but the ancient cities remained absent from these documents, their locations preserved only in the subtle topography of the land itself. As the 20th century advanced, developments in archaeology elsewhere in the world began to provide new tools and perspectives that would eventually penetrate the mysteries of Norte Chico. The discovery of ancient civilizations in Mesopotamia, the decipherment of hieroglyphic scripts, and the development of scientific dating methods all contributed to a growing understanding of humanity's deep past. But these advances had not yet reached the coastal deserts of Peru, where the oldest civilization in the Americas continued its patient sleep beneath the sand. The awakening of Norte Chico began not with a dramatic discovery, but with the quiet observations of a German archaeologist named Max Uhl in the early 1900s. Uhl, working along the Peruvian coast, noted the presence of unusual mounds and earthworks that seemed to predate the well-known cultures of the region. His work was methodical and careful, but the full significance of what he was observing would not become clear for many decades. Uhl's excavations revealed pottery styles and construction techniques that were clearly ancient, but the dating methods available to him were primitive by modern standards. He could establish that these sites were old, very old, but he could not determine just how old. His reports, published in German archaeological journals, attracted limited attention from the international scientific community, which was still focused primarily on the classical civilizations of the Mediterranean and the emerging discoveries in Egypt and Mesopotamia. The political upheavals of the early 20th century to world wars, economic depression, and social revolution diverted attention and resources away from archaeological research in remote regions of South America. The few scholars who did work in Peru were drawn to the more spectacular remains of the Inca and other highland cultures, where stone architecture and precious metal artifacts promised greater rewards for their efforts. However, the seeds of discovery had been planted. Local museums in Lima began to collect artifacts from the coastal regions, and a small community of Peruvian archaeologists started to document the country's pre-Columbian heritage. These early researchers faced enormous challenges: funding, inadequate equipment, and the vast scale of the territory they needed to explore. Yet their work laid the groundwork for future discoveries. The 1940s and 1950s brought new developments in archaeological science that would prove crucial to understanding Norte Chico. The invention of radiocarbon dating by Willard Libby provided, for the first time, a reliable method for determining the age of organic materials. This revolutionary technique would eventually push back the dates of American civilizations by thousands of years. But its application to Peruvian archaeology was still in the future. Meanwhile, aerial photography was beginning to reveal the hidden patterns of ancient landscapes. Military reconnaissance during World War II had demonstrated the power of aerial surveillance to detect archaeological features invisible from ground level. In Peru, early aerial surveys began to reveal the true extent of pre-Columbian settlement, including the complex networks of canals, roads, and ceremonial centers that had once connected the ancient civilizations of the coast. The anthropologist Alfred Kroeber, working in the 1940s, conducted surveys along the Peruvian coast that included the Supe Valley. His work was broad in scope, attempting to document the entire cultural sequence of the region. But he lacked the specialized techniques that would later prove essential to understanding Norte Chico, like Uel before him. Kroeber recognized that these coastal sites were significant, but he could not yet appreciate their true antiquity or their revolutionary implications for our understanding of early civilization. The 1960s brought a new generation of archaeologists to Peru, many of them trained in the scientific methods that were transforming the discipline. These researchers brought with them sophisticated excavation techniques, detailed recording methods, and access to the new scientific dating technologies that were becoming available. They also brought a different perspective, one that was willing to consider the possibility that the Americas had been home to complex civilizations much earlier than previously believed. It was during this period that the first systematic excavations began at some of the Norte Chico sites. The work was slow and painstaking, requiring the careful removal of thousands of years of accumulated sediment to reveal the buried architecture beneath. Each layer of soil told a story, and archaeologists learned to read these stories with increasing sophistication. The discoveries that emerged from these early excavations were puzzling. The sites were clearly ancient, but they did not fit the expected patterns of early civilization. There was monumental architecture, but no pottery. There were complex irrigation systems, but no evidence of the agricultural surpluses that were thought to be necessary for urban development. There were clear signs of social organization and planning, but no obvious signs of warfare or social stratification. These anomalies sparked intense debate among archaeologists. Some dismissed the sites as aberrations, arguing that true civilization could not have emerged without the technological and social developments that characterized other early civilizations. Others began to suspect that they had uncovered something unprecedented day civilization that had developed along entirely different lines from those known elsewhere in the world. The breakthrough came in the 1970s, when radiocarbon dating was finally applied systematically to organic materials from the Norte Chico sites. The results were startling. The dates that emerged pushed the civilization back to around 3500 BCE, making it contemporary with the earliest civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt. Even more remarkably, these dates suggested that Norte Chico had emerged in complete isolation from the Old World, developing its own unique solutions to the challenges of urban life. The scientific community was initially skeptical of these early dates. The idea that the Americas had been home to such an ancient civilization challenged fundamental assumptions about human cultural development. Many archaeologists demanded additional evidence, and some dismissed the findings altogether. But as more sites were excavated and more dates were obtained, the evidence became increasingly difficult to ignore. The 1980s and 1990s saw a gradual acceptance of Norte Chico's antiquity, but the full implications of this discovery were still being debated. The civilization did not fit neatly into existing models of cultural evolution, and its unique characteristics raised new questions about the nature of early urban life. How had such a complex society emerged without the traditional markers of civilization? What could Norte Chico teach us about alternative paths to social complexity? As the 20th century drew to a close, Norte Chico stood at the threshold of international recognition. The sites had been excavated, the dates had been established, and the evidence had been documented. But the wider world was only beginning to appreciate the significance of what had been discovered in the deserts of Peru. The stage was set for Norte Chico to take its place among the great civilizations of the ancient world. The transformation of Norte Chico from archaeological curiosity to world-changing discovery began in earnest during the 1990s, when a new generation of researchers brought fresh perspectives and advanced technologies to bear on the ancient sites. Chief among these was Ruth Shady, a Peruvian archaeologist whose meticulous work would eventually bring Norte Chico to international attention and fundamentally alter our understanding of early civilization. Shady's approach was methodical and comprehensive. Rather than focusing on individual sites, she sought to understand the entire Norte Chico region as an integrated system. Her surveys revealed a landscape dotted with ancient settlements, connected by networks of irrigation, canals and pathways that spoke to a level of coordination and planning that had not been fully appreciated by earlier researchers. The site of Caral, the largest and most complex of the Norte Chico settlements, became the focus of intensive excavation under Shady's direction. As her team carefully removed layers of accumulated sediment, they revealed a city of stunning sophistication. The Great Pyramids, when fully excavated, proved to be even more impressive than initial surveys had suggested. The largest rose to a height of 60 feet, its stepped profile commanding views across the entire valley. But it was not just the scale of the architecture that impressed the excavators. The quality of construction, the precision of the stonework, and the evidence of careful planning all pointed to a society with sophisticated engineering capabilities and complex social organization. The circular plazas, when cleared of debris, revealed intricate stonework and careful attention to acoustics that suggested their use for public ceremonies and gatherings. As the excavations progressed, Shady's team uncovered evidence of a civilization that challenged many fundamental assumptions about early urban life. The absence of pottery, once seen as a primitive characteristic, now appeared to be a conscious choice rather than a technological limitation. The people of Norte Chico had developed sophisticated techniques for food storage and preparation that did not require ceramic vessels, relying instead on gourds, baskets, and stone containers. The dating evidence that emerged from these new excavations was even more compelling than the earlier results. Radiocarbon dates from multiple sites and multiple contexts all pointed to the same conclusion. Norte Chico had flourished between 3500 and 1800 BCE, making it not only contemporary with the earliest civilizations of the Old World, but potentially preceding them in some respects. The implications of these dates were staggering. If Norte Chico was indeed as old as the evidence suggested, it meant that complex urban civilization had emerged independently in the Americas thousands of years earlier than previously believed. This discovery challenged the conventional narrative of human cultural development, which had long held that civilization was a recent phenomenon that had spread from a few centers in the Old World. The scientific community's response to these findings was mixed. Some archaeologists embraced the new evidence, recognizing its potential to revolutionize our understanding of early civilization. Others remained skeptical, pointing to the unusual characteristics of Norte Chico culture and questioning whether it truly deserved to be called a civilization. In the traditional sense, this debate touched on fundamental questions about the nature of civilization itself. What criteria should be used to identify early urban societies? Was the presence of writing essential, or could other forms of information, storage, and transmission serve the same purpose? Did the absence of clear social hierarchies indicate a more egalitarian society, or simply different forms of social organization? The discovery of Norte Chico also forced archaeologists to reconsider the role of the Americas in world history. For too long, the Western Hemisphere had been viewed as a latecomer to civilization, its peoples seen as primitive compared to their Old World contemporaries. The evidence from Norte Chico suggested a very different story, one in which the Americas had been home to sophisticated societies from the very beginning of the urban revolution. As news of the discoveries spread beyond the archaeological community, Norte Chico began to attract international attention. National Geographic featured the sites in a major article, bringing them to the attention of a global audience. Television documentaries followed, and soon tourists were making pilgrimages to the remote valleys of Peru to see the ancient pyramids for themselves. The Peruvian government, recognizing the significance of the discoveries, began to invest in the preservation and study of the Norte Chico sites. Caral was designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2009, ensuring its protection for future generations. Museums were established to display the artifacts and interpret the findings for the public. Meanwhile, the scientific investigation of Norte Chico continued to yield new insights. Advanced dating techniques confirmed and refined the chronology of the civilization. Environmental studies revealed the sophisticated agricultural and aquacultural systems that had supported the urban population. Analysis of human remains provided evidence of diet, health, and social organization. One of the most intriguing discoveries was the evidence for long-distance trade networks that connected Norte Chico to regions throughout Peru and beyond. Exotic materials found at the site shells from the coast, minerals from the highlands, and plants from the Amazon demonstrated that the civilization had been part of a complex web of exchange, relationships that spanned the entire South American continent. The musical instruments recovered from the sites provided another window into Norte Chico culture. The bone flutes, when analyzed by experts, revealed sophisticated understanding of acoustic principles and musical theory. When played, they produced haunting melodies that that seemed to bridge the gap between the ancient and modern worlds, offering a direct connection to the cultural life of the civilization. Perhaps most significantly, the discovery of Norte Chico has forced scholars to reconsider the entire trajectory of human cultural development. The civilization's unique characteristics, apparent lack of warfare, its sophisticated environmental management, its complex social organization without obvious hierarchies, suggest alternative paths to social complexity that had been largely ignored by previous theories. As the 21st century advanced, Norte Chico took its place among the great civilizations of the ancient world. No longer could scholars speak of civilization as a purely old world phenomenon, or dismiss the Americas as a cultural backwater. The pyramids of Peru stood as monuments to human ingenuity and creativity, testaments to the capacity of our species to develop complex societies under the most diverse conditions. The recognition of Norte Chico as one of the world's oldest civilizations has reverberated through multiple disciplines, reshaping not only our understanding of the past, but our perspectives on the future. The discovery has forced archaeologists, anthropologists, historians, and even environmental scientists to reconsider fundamental assumptions about human society and its relationship with the natural world. In the field of archaeology, Norte Chico has become a touchstone for discussions about the nature of early civilization. The traditional checklist of civilizational markers, monumental architecture, specialized crafts, social stratification, and urban centers has been refined and expanded to accommodate the unique characteristics of this ancient society. The civilization's emphasis on textiles rather than pottery, its apparent lack of warfare, and its sophisticated environmental management have all contributed to a more nuanced understanding of what it means to be civilized. The environmental lessons embedded in Norte Chico's success and eventual transformation have particular relevance for contemporary discussions about sustainability and climate change. The civilization's sophisticated water management systems, its sustainable fishing practices, and its careful balance between agriculture and aquaculture offer models for modern societies grappling with environmental challenges. The fact that Norte Chico flourished for over a millennium suggests that sustainable relationships with the environment are not only possible, but essential for long-term social stability. Urban planners and architects have also found inspiration in Norte Chico's approach to city design, the integration of ceremonial spaces with residential areas, the careful attention to acoustics and sightlines, and the harmonious relationship between built and natural environments all offer lessons for contemporary urban development. The civilization's ability to support significant populations without the environmental degradation that characterizes many modern cities suggests alternative approaches to urban planning that prioritize sustainability and social cohesion. The discovery has also had profound implications for our understanding of human migration and cultural diffusion. The early date of Norte Chico, combined with its clear independence from Old World civilizations, demonstrates that complex societies can emerge independently under the right conditions. This finding has encouraged archaeologists to look more carefully for early civilizations in other regions of the world, leading to discoveries of sophisticated societies in places that were previously thought to be peripheral to the main currents of human cultural development. In the realm of social organization, Norte Chico's apparent lack of pronounced social hierarchies has sparked new discussions about alternative forms of governance and social coordination. The civilization's ability to undertake massive construction projects and maintain complex trade networks without obvious ruling elites suggests that cooperation and consensus building can be as effective as authoritarian control in organizing large-scale human societies. The textile arts of Norte Chico have also had a lasting impact on contemporary culture. The sophisticated cotton textiles found at the sites have inspired modern designers and artists, while the techniques used by ancient weavers have been studied and revived by craftspeople around the world. The civilization's emphasis on fiber arts rather than pottery has also contributed to a broader appreciation of textiles as a form of high art and cultural expression. Educational institutions around the world have incorporated the story of Norte Chico into their curricula, using it to teach students about the diversity of human cultural achievement and the importance of environmental stewardship. The civilization's story offers a powerful counter-narrative to Eurocentric accounts of human development, demonstrating that innovation and sophistication have emerged independently in many different parts of the world. The preservation of Norte Chico has also become a model for heritage conservation efforts in other parts of the world. The careful balance between archaeological research, public education, and site protection that has been achieved in Peru offers lessons for other countries struggling to preserve their ancient heritage while making it accessible to the public. The involvement of local communities in the preservation and interpretation of the sites has been particularly important, ensuring that the legacy of Norte Chico remains connected to the people who live in the region today. Perhaps most importantly, the discovery of Norte Chico has expanded our conception of human potential. The civilization's achievement sits monumental architecture, its sophisticated social organization, its sustainable environmental practices, and its rich cultural life demonstrate that our ancestors were capable of remarkable creativity and innovation. This recognition has implications not only for how we understand the past, but for how we approach the challenges of the present and future. The musical traditions of Norte Chico have also found new life in the contemporary world. Ethnomusicologists have studied the bone flutes and other instruments found at the sites, and modern musicians have created new compositions based on the scales and melodies suggested by these ancient artifacts. The haunting sounds of Norte Chico music, reconstructed from archaeological evidence, offer a direct connection to the emotional and spiritual life of the civilization. Scientific research continues to reveal new aspects of Norte Chico culture and society. Advanced analytical techniques have identified the sources of raw materials used in construction and craft production, mapping the extensive trade networks that connected the civilization to distant regions. Genetic studies of crop remains have revealed the sophisticated agricultural practices that supported the urban population, while isotopic analysis of human remains has provided insights into diet, health, and social organization. The story of Norte Chico has also become part of the broader narrative of human resilience and adaptability. The civilization's ability to thrive in the challenging environment of the Peruvian coast, its successful adaptation to climate change, and its eventual transformation into new cultural forms all demonstrate the remarkable capacity of human societies to respond to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential character as we face our own environmental and social challenges. The example of Norte Chico offers both inspiration and practical guidance. The civilization's emphasis on cooperation over competition, its sophisticated environmental management, and its rich cultural life suggest pathways toward more sustainable and equitable forms of human society. The ancient wisdom embedded in The pyramids and plazas of Peru continues to speak to us across the millennia, offering lessons that are as relevant today as they were 5,000 years ago. The ongoing research at Norte Chico sites ensures that new discoveries will continue to refine and expand our understanding of this remarkable civilization. Each new excavation, each new analysis, each new interpretation adds another piece to the puzzle of human cultural development. The story of Norte Chico is far from complete, and future generations of researchers will undoubtedly uncover new insights that will further transform our understanding of the past and its relevance to the present. In the end, the legacy of Norte Chico extends far beyond the boundaries of archaeology and anthropology. It touches on fundamental questions about human nature, social organization, and our relationship with the environment. The civilization's story reminds us that there are many paths to social complexity and cultural achievement, and that the diversity of human experience is far richer than we often imagine. As we continue to explore and understand the legacy of Norte Chico, we are really exploring the full potential of human civilization itself. Night falls over the Supe Valley, and the ancient pyramids stand silhouetted against the star-filled sky. The same constellations that guided the ceremonies of Norte Chico 5,000 years ago wheel overhead, their patterns unchanged by the passage of millennia. In the darkness, the weight of time seems to compress, and the boundary between past and present grows thin. The wind carries whispers across the desert landscape, not the voices of the dead, but the eternal conversation between earth and sky, between human ambition and natural law. The pyramids, weathered by centuries but still standing, have become monuments not just to a lost civilization but to the enduring human desire to create meaning from the raw materials of existence. In the nearby villages, descendants of the ancient peoples go about their evening routines, their daily lives connected to the past by threads both visible and invisible. The cotton they grow springs from seeds that carry the genetic memory of plants first cultivated by Norte Chico farmers. The rivers they depend upon flow in channels first shaped by ancient engineers. The very soil beneath their feet has been enriched by the decomposed remains of countless generations who lived and died in this valley. The archaeological sites, now protected by law and celebrated by scholars, have become pilgrimage destinations for those seeking to understand humanity's deepest roots. Visitors come from around the world to walk among the ancient structures, to touch stones laid by hands that have been dust for millennia, to stand where ceremonies were performed before the pyramids of Egypt were built. Yet Norte Chico's greatest gift to the modern world may not be found in its physical remains, but in the questions it raises about the nature of human possibility. In choosing cooperation over conquest, sustainability over exploitation, and cultural richness over material accumulation, the ancient civilization blazed a trail that modern society is only beginning to rediscover. The textile fragments that survive from Norte Chico, faded but still bearing traces of their original colors, speak to the civilization's understanding that beauty and function need not be separate. The intricate patterns woven into these ancient fabrics encode information about social relationships, religious beliefs, and artistic traditions that transcended the merely practical in a world increasingly dominated by digital communication. These physical artifacts remind us of the power of tangible creation to carry meaning across time. The absence of weapons and fortifications at Norte Chico sites continues to puzzle and inspire researchers. In an age when warfare seems endemic to human civilization, the example of a complex society that apparently resolved its conflicts through other means offers a vision of alternative possibilities. The civilization's emphasis on large-scale, public works rather than private wealth accumulation suggests forms of social organization that prioritized collective well-being over individual aggrandizement, as climate change and environmental degradation threaten the stability of modern civilization. The sophisticated water management systems of Norte Chico offer practical lessons in sustainable development. The civilization's ability to support large populations while maintaining ecological balance for over a millennium stands as a testament to the possibility of harmonious relationships between human society and the natural world. The musical instruments of Norte Chico, silent for thousands of years, have been given new voice by modern musicians who have studied their construction and tuning. The melodies they produce, based on mathematical principles discovered through archaeological analysis, create an auditory bridge between the ancient and modern worlds. In concert halls and recording studios, the songs of Norte Chico live again, their haunting beauty touching contemporary audiences with the same power they held for ancient listeners. The excavations continue, revealing new details about daily life in the ancient civilization. Recent discoveries have uncovered evidence of sophisticated astronomical observations, complex mathematical systems, and religious practices that emphasized the interconnectedness of all life. Each new finding adds another dimension to our understanding of a society that achieved remarkable complexity while maintaining apparent social cohesion. Perhaps most significantly, Norte Chico has forced us to reconsider the very definition of human achievement. The civilization's lack of writing, once seen as a deficiency, now appears as evidence of alternative forms of information, storage, and transmission. The apparent absence of a ruling elite, once interpreted as primitive social organization, now suggests more egalitarian forms of governance. The emphasis on textiles, rather than pottery, once viewed as a technological limitation, now appears as a conscious choice that reflected deep cultural values. The story of Norte Chico reminds us that human civilization is not a single story, but a vast tapestry woven from countless individual threads. Each culture, each society, each generation adds its own unique contribution to this larger pattern. The ancient peoples of the Supe Valley, working with cotton and stone, irrigation, water, and ocean fish, created their own distinctive contribution to the human story, one that continues to resonate across the centuries. As night deepens over the valley, the ancient pyramids stand as silent witnesses to the passage of time. They have survived the rise and fall of empires, the coming of new peoples, and the transformations of the modern world. They will likely survive long after our own civilization has run its course, carrying their message of human possibility into an unimaginable future. In the end, Norte Chico speaks to something eternal in the human spirit, the desire to create, to build, to leave something of lasting value for future generations. The civilization's builders could not have imagined that their work would one day inspire people on the other side of the world, or that their innovations would inform discussions about humanity's future. Yet, in their dedication to their craft, their attention to their environment, and their commitment to their community, they created something that transcends the boundaries of time and place. The winds that blow across the Supe Valley carry the scent of the sea and the memory of rain in the mountains. They have blown across this landscape for millions of years, shaping the hills and valleys, carrying seeds and birds, witnesses to the slow dance of geological and biological change. For a brief moment in this vast span of time, human beings created something extraordinary in this place, a civilization that honored both the earth and the sky, that built for permanence while living in harmony with change. The pyramids stand dark against the stars, their shadows merging with the natural contours of the landscape. In the morning, the sun will rise over the mountains and illuminate the ancient stones, revealing once again the careful craftsmanship of people who lived and died thousands of years ago. Visitors will come to marvel at what remains. Archaeologists will continue their patient work of excavation and analysis, and the story of Norte Chico will continue to unfold. But for now, in the darkness and the silence, the ancient valley rests in the embrace of eternity. The civilization that once flourished here has returned to the earth that gave it birth, its people scattered like seeds on the wind, its buildings slowly merging with the landscape that surrounds them. Yet something essential remains a testament to human creativity and ingenuity, a reminder that our species is capable of remarkable achievements. When we work in harmony with the natural world and with each other, the stars wheel overhead, marking the passage of time in their eternal dance. Somewhere in their light, the spirit of Norte Chico lives on, not as a ghost of the past, but as a living inspiration for the future. In the silence of the desert night, the ancient civilization speaks to us still, whispering of possibilities we have yet to imagine, of harmonies we have yet to achieve, of a world where human ambition and natural wisdom walk hand in hand toward a sustainable and beautiful future. If this journey through the timeless story of Norte Chico has moved you, if these whispers from the ancient world have touched your spirit, take a moment to like this video and share it with others who might find meaning in these forgotten voices. Subscribe to our channel to continue exploring the hidden treasures of human history, and let us know in the comments which lost civilization you'd like to discover next. Together, we can keep the stories of our ancestors alive, honoring their wisdom as we write our own chapter in the eternal human story.